Every region carries something beneath its surface, a quietness that lives in the details, in the spaces between what is known and what remains worth discovering. Hoenn is that kind of place. It breathes differently than other regions, warmer along its coast, heavier with rain in the north, dense with forest in places where the light barely reaches. And the creatures that live there carry that same quality. They are specific, or they are layered. They hold small truths inside them if you look closely enough. There are 135 of them in total. Each one arrived in the world through a process of careful thought, iteration, and quiet decision. And every single one of them, from the smallest acorn-sized seedling to the ancient stone guardians sleeping in their sealed chambers, has something worth knowing. If you find this kind of calm exploration worth your time, consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club and let me know where you're watching from tonight. As we begin, let the facts arrive gently, like water finding its level, and let the region of Hoenn unfold one quiet detail at a time. Trico lives in the forest, and it has been there since the beginning of the Hoenn story. It is a small, unassuming creature, pale green, and calm in the way that old trees are calm. There is something in the way it moves that suggests it has been moving through canopy and bark for a very long time, long enough to understand the rhythm of branches and the patience required by anything that grows. In the anime, a version of Trico existed that was very old, much older than one would expect to encounter. It was still wild, still living among the roots and trunks of the trees it called home. It was a strange and quiet sight. Age in a small creature carries its own kind of gravity. Grovel followed Trico, and Grovel carried a lesson about teaching. In the anime, Ash's Trico learned the move Bullet Seed not from a trainer or a book, but from Natasha's Grovel, who demonstrated using watermelon seeds. It was a small, practical moment of education. It suggested something larger about how knowledge passes between living creatures, how movement and mimicry are sometimes the truest form of instruction. Skeptile completed the line, and when it reached its mega form, something changed in the way it fought. Mega Skeptile launches its own tail at the opponent, like a living projectile, something that a real lizard might do to distract or wound a predator. The detail feels grounded in nature, even inside a world of fantasy, and that groundedness is part of what makes the grass starters of Hoenn feel so specific. Torchic came into the world carrying a detail that most trainers would never notice, and that is the point. Male Torchic have a small black marking on their body, an almost invisible dot that carries a long history inside it. In Japan, in the early 1900s, poultry farmers developed a method of identifying newborn chicks by gender because at that age, the difference is nearly impossible to see. The marking on Torchic is a quiet nod to that practice, something slipped into the design for those who know where to look. Combuskin stood between Torchic and Blaziken for many years, and for 15 of those years, its shiny coloration was different from what the original designers had intended. Then it was quietly corrected, returned to the red feathers it was always meant to wear. Small corrections like that move through a franchise like whispers, noticed only by those paying very close attention. Blaziken arrived at the end of that line and almost arrived looking different entirely. Early planning for the Hoenn games imagined Blaziken as a hybrid creature, something between itself and Latias. Some concept imagery even suggested that Ash might travel on its back, soaring across the region the way other stories place riders on dragons. That version of Blaziken never appeared in any finished game, but the idea of it drifts through the history of the games, like smoke from something that burned briefly and then went out. Mudkip appeared in a world where size was not always what it seemed. In the anime, giant Mudkip were shown living near nesting sites, guarding the places where newly hatched young were most vulnerable. That role is usually given to the adult stage of an evolutionary line, to something like Swampert. But here it was Mudkip, large and steady and watchful, filling a space that logic would not have predicted for it. Marshtomp occupied the middle of that line with an expression that many players over the years have described as unsettling. The official Pokémon account eventually acknowledged this. There is something in Marshtomp's face that is difficult to categorize, something that sits just slightly outside comfort. It was noticed, documented, and gently laughed about by the people who made it, which is its own kind of tenderness. Swampert carried a quieter distinction. Through specific game mechanics and very particular conditions, Swampert could theoretically reach a damage output of over 566 million in a single moment. It is the kind of number that exists at the edge of what the game's mathematics were designed to contain. Most Swampert never come anywhere close to it, but the possibility lives there, somewhere deep inside the numbers, patient and enormous. Poochyena and Zigzagoon greeted trainers at the very beginning of the Hoenn journey. Zigzagoon followed Professor Birch through the opening moments of Pokémon Emerald, making the first battle of that game a small and chaotic comedy. But the game was kind. When a player's health dropped too low, Zigzagoon would flee. The player could not lose that fight. It was designed to be the beginning of something, not the end. Lunahuna moved differently than almost any other Pokémon. Its Pokédex entries described a creature that ran only at full speed and only in straight lines, turning only at perfect right angles. In Pokémon Sword and Shield, players who looked carefully could see this behavior happening in the overworld. Lunahuna would bolt forward and then pivot sharply, moving across the landscape in a pattern that looked more like a diagram than an animal, efficient and angular and oddly precise. Wurmple held a hidden secret in its evolution. Whether a given Wurmple would become Silcoon or Cascoon was decided not by anything the player did, but by an invisible value stored in the game's code, a personality number that the player had no access to and could not influence. It was a design choice that placed a small moment of genuine uncertainty inside the game, an outcome no amount of planning could guarantee. Silcoon was quiet in its cocoon state. A Pokémon card once depicted it, using a soap-like substance to clean itself against tree bark while it waited to evolve, a small domestic detail in the middle of a transformation. Beautifully emerged from that waiting, with eyes that the Pokédex described in terms that felt more like a predator's equipment than a butterfly's ornament. Those beautiful compound eyes were described as stabbing tools, used to pierce and drain. The softness of the design carried something sharp beneath it. Cascoon waited as Silcoon did, but with a different quality of memory. Cascoon did not forget what hurt it. Its Pokédex entries were clear on this point. Whatever struck it while it rested in that shell would be remembered, and when Dustox emerged, that memory came with it. Cascoon transformed pain into patience, and patience into purpose. Dustox inherited something unusual from its cocoon stage. Before a particular ability was introduced into the game that allowed any Pokémon to inflict poison on poison types, Dustox stood alone as the only poison-type Pokémon that could be poisoned. This was because if a Cascoon of bug type was poisoned and then evolved, the resulting Dustox would carry that condition into its new form. It was a mechanical wrinkle, a small edge case that existed because the rules were honest about their own logic. Lotad carried a warmth in its Pokédex entries that was easy to overlook. It was described as a creature known for ferrying small Pokémon across water, a kind of miniature transport for those too small to cross on their own. The comparison to Lapras came naturally and quietly, a gentle echo of an older, larger act of kindness. Lombre arrived in the world, carrying a translation tucked inside its Chinese name. The characters used there meant something like Lotus Hat Lad, a phrase that captured the creature's visual poetry without explaining it. A wide lily pad, worn like a hat, a slouching posture. A personality that in its final evolution would be described as responding to festive music with a surge of cellular energy, every part of its body filling with something like joy when the right rhythm arrived. Ludicolo danced because it was built to dance. Its cells responded to festive sound the way a plant responds to light, not as a choice but as a function. In Pokémon Colosseum, the villain Myra B used an entire team of Ludicolo, and the music that played when he appeared was designed to match that fact. The battle theme was festive and rolling and deliberately energetic. The world had bent slightly toward his Pokémon. Seedot attached itself to tree branches by the top of its head, drawing moisture from the wood directly. The more water it consumed, the shinier its surface became. It was a small, self-contained system of nourishment, and there was something meditative in the image of it hanging there, absorbing what it needed from the thing it held on to. Nuzleaf played a leaf like a flute, according to several Pokédex entries across multiple games. The sound it produced was described as eerie and unsettling enough to cause unease in those who heard it. And yet, despite this long-standing description, Nuzleaf has never been able to learn the move Grass Whistle. The music existed in the Pokédex but not in the move list, a quiet contradiction that lived in the gap between description and function. Shiftry was built around the Tengu, Japanese mythological creatures associated with mountain forests, spiritual power, and the ability to read minds. The Tengu were famously said to have access to the interior thoughts of those around them, and yet Shiftry, across its entire evolutionary line, was never given the ability to learn the move Mind Reader. The myth and the mechanics diverged in the same quiet way that Nuzleaf's leaf music diverged from Grass Whistle. Tylo was a Pokémon that flew south when cold weather came and north when it passed, according to its Pokédex. And yet, in Pokémon Park, Tylo appeared in the Iceberg Zone, standing in the cold with apparent ease. The Pokédex and the game held different truths about the same creature, and neither corrected the other. Swellow appeared in one of the stranger moments of the anime's long history. Ash's Pikachu used thunder on a Swellow mid-battle, and rather than causing harm, the two creatures entered a synchronized state, sometimes called thunder armor. The explanation that held together best was mechanical. The thunder likely caused paralysis, which triggered Swellow's ability Guts, which boosted its attack by 50%. Physics and game logic arrived at the same place from different directions and briefly agreed. Wingull had the distinction of appearing in every regional Pokédex since its introduction. Not just Hoenn, but every region that added it afterward kept it on the list. It became one of the constants of the Pokémon world, a small white bird, always present somewhere, always calling over water. In the anime, it appeared as a carrier, delivering equipment in its large beak, a Wingull serving the Team Rocket organization by storing a device full of Pokeballs inside the space its pouched beak provided. Ralts appeared in a famous episode of the anime involving Wally, the young trainer, whose own Ralts would eventually become one of the most beloved partnerships in the games. In Pokémon Emerald, the Ralts that Wally encounters has a small chance of being shiny. During one documented speedrun of the game, this event actually occurred. The runner, at full speed through the game's mechanics, was briefly stopped by the shimmer of a shiny Ralts appearing in the moment designed to be a tutorial. Kirlia appeared in the anime disguised, and the disguise was broken by a Pokédex. In that episode, a version of Meowth disguised as a Kirlia had its cover blown when a passing player used their Pokédex on it. The device recognized Meowth as Meowth, and the illusion collapsed. The Pokédex was simply honest. Gardevoir carried a breeding compatibility list that surprised many trainers. It could breed with Mook, with Weezing, with Swalot, and with Wylord, among others. The logic of egg groups placed Gardevoir in the same compatibility circle as creatures that shared almost no visual or thematic resemblance to it. The game's mechanics operated on categories that the designs sometimes made very strange. Surskit arrived with a name that carried Swedish inside it. The word sur in Swedish means sour, and the syllable kit comes from a word meaning something like skate or glide. Surskit was the sour skater, a small creature skating on the surface of water and secreting a sweet syrup from its legs. The name held its meaning quietly, in a language that most players would never think to check. Masquerain evolved from a water type and then developed a dislike of rain. Its name contained the word rain, and its origin was aquatic. And yet Masquerain preferred dry conditions, avoided rainfall, became agitated when the weather turned wet. A creature named for rain and born of water had grown into something that flinched from the sky. Shroomish offered a small visual surprise to those willing to turn their game screen upside down. The face of a Shroomish, viewed inverted, became something unexpected, a different arrangement of features that looked almost like another expression entirely. It was a small joke, hidden in the design, visible only to the patient or the curious. Slakoth slept for nearly all of its waking hours, and from that stillness it became Vigoroth, which could not stop moving. Vigoroth's body ran so hot with energy that sleep was impossible. Its vital spirit burned too bright for rest, and because of that inability, Vigoroth was the only Pokémon that could not access the Dream World feature in later games. Other Pokémon with the same ability had alternate abilities to fall back on. Vigoroth had only one, and that one kept it awake. Slaking returned to stillness, on the other side of Vigoroth's restlessness. In the Pokémon Adventures manga, Norman, the gym leader, used a specific double battle combination to work around Slaking's limitation. Pairing it with a Spinda using Skill Swap would transfer the restrictive ability away, briefly allowing Slaking to act without constraint. The strategy was careful and deliberate, someone who understood what his Pokémon needed and built a system around that need. Nincada carried one of the most unusual facts in all of Hoenn. When it evolved into Ninjask under specific conditions, and with an empty slot in the party, a second Pokémon would appear in that empty space without warning. A Shedinja would arrive, silent and hollow, a ghost living inside the discarded shell of a transformation. A shiny Nincada under those conditions would produce two shiny Pokémon at once, doubling something that was already rare. Whismur had something that took players a long time to notice, a detail in its design that sat just on the edge of propriety. Its evolution, Loudred shared that quality. Exploud lost the detail in its final form, becoming something that Pokédex entries described as a communications device, a creature that distant cities once used to send signals across long distances. It was a new piece of lore delivered in a generation that came much later, retconning a Hoenn Pokémon into something slightly larger than it had been before. Makuhita trained by slapping tree trunks repeatedly, hardening its palms until they became dense and powerful. But according to one Pokédex entry, it had once struck a Sudowoodo accidentally, and the force of the impact had sent it flying. There was something humbling in that detail, the creature that practiced strength against wood, being reminded by the wood that strength alone was not enough. Hariyama arrived with a catch rate that was higher than its pre-evolutions. Makuhita had a catch rate of 180. Hariyama, the larger and more powerful evolved form, had a rate of 200, making it statistically easier to catch. The numbers moved in an unexpected direction, and the game offered no explanation for why. Azurill spent its early life as a normal type, before the introduction of fairy typing changed what it was. It evolved into Marill, a water type, making the line one of the few in the games to carry a type shift between pre-evolution and evolution. Some theorized that its lack of arms had something to do with its original classification, a creature without the limbs needed to swim being something other than a water type until it grew into the form that could manage in the water. Nosepass would always face north if a player ran from it in Pokemon Go. This was not an accident. Nosepass was the compass Pokemon, and the detail had been carried from its Pokedex entries into the behavior of its in-game model. It turned northward in the wild, oriented itself to something the player could not see, and waited there. Skitty was small and underestimated, but it was the best Pokemon for speedrunning the Red and Blue Mystery Dungeon games. Its ability Normalize made every move it used normal type, giving it stab on everything. It could learn Double Slap, Attract, and Tail Whip, all of which interacted favorably with the mechanics of those particular games. Skitty was not chosen for those runs because it was powerful. It was chosen because it fit the structure of that specific system perfectly. Delcatty and its pre-evolution Skitty were connected to the Moonstone, evolving through its use in a long tradition of stone evolutions that reached back to the earliest games. But despite that connection, they were the only Moonstone evolution line that could never be caught with a Moonball. The games where they appeared did not have the Moonball, and the games that had the Moonball did not have them in the wild. The connection existed on paper and dissolved in practice. Sableye ate gemstones. Its diet was minerals, specifically carbuncle, which was a type of gemstone, and also the very thing that fairy types were weak against. Sableye's natural food source was its only natural weakness. The creature sustained itself on the substance that could end it. Mega Mawile held one of the highest effective attack statistics in the game, reaching a number that came not from a single stat, but from the multiplication of its base attack by the ability Huge Power. The math produced something enormous from materials that looked modest on paper. It was the kind of strength that didn't announce itself until it had already arrived. Aron sounded like something much larger than it looked. Its cry in the anime struck many listeners as resembling the sound of Rhyhorn, a bulkier and more ancient-seeming creature. The resemblance made a quiet argument for some shared ancestry, some distant branching point where the lines of rock and steel diverged from a common source. Agron weighed 800 pounds and was a steel and rock type combination among the heaviest typings available to it, and it could learn Surf, which required it to enter and move through water with its massive steel frame. The image was absurd, and the game offered it without comment. Metatite and Metacum occupied a particular corner of the game's design. Metatite had an ability called Pure Power that doubled its attack stat, working exactly like the ability Huge Power. The abilities had different names and the same mechanical function. The game maintained two separate words for an identical effect, given to different Pokemon as if the distinction between them mattered, even when it didn't. Electric carried a warning for the overly enthusiastic. If a player used a metal brush to groom one, the resulting static discharge would deliver a significant shock. The Pokedex presented this as something to know rather than something to avoid, information offered neutrally to whoever was listening. Manectric drew from the Raiju of Japanese mythology, a creature that appeared in different shapes and different forms, but always carried lightning. The Raiju could take the shape of a blue wolf wrapped in white and yellow electricity, and Manectric echoed that form in its design. The myth was old, and the Pokemon was new, and the silhouette between them held something that looked like recognition. Plusle and Minun appeared in a list that most people did not know existed. In the data files of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, There were 7 unused characters, sometimes called the Forbidden Seven, Pokémon that had been prepared to some degree, but were never included in the final roster. Plusle and Minun were on that list, their names appearing in files that referred to them by the beginning of their Japanese names. The electric pair that celebrated together had been almost somewhere else entirely. Volbate's shiny form resembled Illumise, its counterpart in non-shiny coloration. The two were always designed as a pair, appearing together in the games and in the anime, and their shiny forms closed the distance between them further, making Volbeat look more like Illumise's regular appearance. When breeding with a Ditto, either one could produce an egg that hatched into the other. The pair was porous, interchangeable at the level of reproduction in a way that most gendered pairs in the games were not. Roselia was described in its Pokédex entries as a Pokémon that, when given nutritionally rich spring water, would bloom in a rare coloration. This was offered as an explanation for why shiny Roselia had different flower colors than the standard form. The game provided its own lore for its own mechanics, folding the accident of shininess into something that felt like it had always been there. Gulpin was based on the blobfish, a creature known for its formless appearance outside of its native deep-water pressure. The Pokémon and the animal shared a rounded shapelessness, a quality of containing more than they appeared to. In the anime, a Gulpin used Water Gun, a move it technically could not learn. The games and the anime sometimes agreed and sometimes did not, and neither seemed troubled by the difference. Carvanha could bite through solid steel. Its Pokédex entries and a particular Pokémon card both made this point clearly. It was a small fish, and it was capable of that. Sharpedo extended that capacity into something that swam at speeds exceeding 75 miles per hour, while tearing through the water with enough force to cut whatever it struck. At the 2002 Pokémon Festa, players were given a Sharpedo as their starting Pokémon to test the early builds of Ruby and Sapphire. A Sharpedo in place of Trico, Torchic, or Mudkip, thrown into the beginning of a game that had not yet become the game anyone would eventually play. The test version and the final version were very different places. Wailmer and Wailord completed one of the more discussed size discrepancies in all of Pokémon. Wailord's height made it one of the largest Pokémon ever recorded. Its density was so low that some calculations suggested it would float in air, a creature that could fill a sky, lighter than the clouds, a whale the size of a blue whale, and lighter than a cubic meter of air. Numel and Camerupt traveled through the development process under different names. The creature that would become Camerupt appeared in early files as Donkey, and also as Bakuda, and Duda, and Gon, and Dona. 5 different potential identities cycling through the naming process, while the design beneath them was still being settled. The multiplicity of names said something about a concept still searching for itself, and the final name, Camerupt, arrived as a sign that the search was over. Torkoal carried in its beta form a fluffy tail that connected it visually to the minigame, a mythological Japanese turtle believed to live for 10,000 years, and depicted with a long trailing growth of seaweed behind it. The final version of Torkoal lost the tail. The shell became more explicitly the feature, the incense diffuser shape of it, more focused, the connection to ancient wisdom simplified into the image of a creature that breathed coal smoke and endured. Spoink's situation was one of the more melancholy facts in the entire Pokédex. It bounced continuously on its spring-like tail, and according to its entries, if it ever stopped bouncing, its heart would stop. The image of Spoink sleeping became uncomfortable when this was known. The creature that had to keep moving to stay alive. It appeared in Pokémon Pinball as a spring-loader knob, repurposed for a game that moved fast and struck hard, which was appropriate. Spinda carried 4.2 billion possible spot patterns, Every Spinda that existed was generated with a different arrangement of the marks on its body, and the shiny version effectively doubled that to 8.5 billion variations. In a horde battle containing multiple shiny Spindas with matching patterns, a player would be witnessing something so statistically unlikely that the game itself offered no way to calculate the odds of seeing it. The suggestion was to purchase a lottery ticket. Trapinch held its Japanese name like a key. The name translated to nutcracker, and the connection was in the jaw, in the pit, in the patience of a creature that dug a conical trap in the sand and waited for something to fall in. Vibrava emerged from that and carried a different kind of power. Its wings beat so quickly that the vibrations produced headaches in anyone nearby, including in one anime episode, Ash himself, who was shown experiencing the physical effect of a Vibrava trying to be caught. Flygon arrived at the end of that line and almost received a Mega Evolution in the generation of games where Mega Evolutions were first introduced. According to an interview with the director, a Mega Flygon was planned and reached some stage of development before the designer responsible for it experienced what was described as an artist's block. The idea did not resolve, and the Mega form was not included in the final game. Somewhere between intention and completion, the design stopped. Cacnea was 1 foot tall and weighed 113 pounds. The density of it was difficult to picture, a small green cactus ball of improbable weight. Cacturn extended that into something stranger. After spending thousands of years in harsh desert conditions, its blood had transformed into a substance chemically identical to sand. It was the desert made briefly animate, the landscape wearing a shape that moved when the sun went down. Swablu was not a dragon type. It was normal and flying, which placed it among the most ordinary typings available, and it was the only normal type Pokémon that evolved into a dragon type. Altaria wore clouds around it like wings, and had a warmth in its design that made it one of the most beloved dragon types, despite being one of the gentlest. A wet Altaria, when depicted in official materials, lost much of that softness and revealed the shape beneath the clouds. It was a different creature in the rain. Zangoose and Seviper were rivals in the strictest sense. In Pokémon X and Y, when a player encountered a horde of Zangoose, there would always be exactly one Seviper present in the group. Before any of them attacked the player, the Zangoose in the horde would turn on the Seviper first, attacking the enemy in their midst before dealing with the outside threat. The rivalry was written into the mechanics of the encounter itself, or despite that enmity, the two species were biologically compatible enough to produce eggs when paired. Lunatone and Solrock both appeared in connection to an old man in the Hana Desert in Pokémon Sun and Moon. If a player had one of them in their party and spoke to this man, he would recall something like a distant memory and give them a moonstone or a sunstone, depending on which Pokémon they carried. He would then rise into the sky and disappear, apparently into space. A later event distributed special versions of Lunatone and Solrock that were implied to have been his, the Pokémon he had carried before ascending. Barboach was scheduled to debut in an anime episode centered around its hometown and the community connected to it. The episode was planned and reportedly near completion when an earthquake struck Japan. The episode was quietly shelved. After that point, the moves Earthquake, Fissure, and Magnitude ceased to appear in the anime entirely. The sensitivity was understood, and the decision was not reversed. Whiscash appeared in the games with a surprising mechanical fact. A Master Ball, the single Pokéball designed to catch any Pokémon without fail, was used in one documented instance against a Whiscash in the anime, and it failed. Whiscash was the only Pokémon ever to negate a Master Ball in official Pokémon media. The game's absolute certainty meant something stubborn enough to refuse it. Corphish was not originally from Hoenn. Its Pokédex entries stated clearly that it was a foreign Pokémon, an invasive species brought in as a pet and then released or escaped into the wild. It had thrived despite, or perhaps because of, its non-native status. The question of where Corphish and Crawdaunt had actually originated was left open. The Pokédex noted that uncertainty without resolving it. Baltoy and Claydol formed the only evolutionary line in the game that was both ground and psychic type. It was a combination that felt ancient, as if the typing had been decided in a place where clay was sacred and thought moved through the earth the way water did. In the anime, an ancient and enormous Claydol appeared sealed inside a giant stone Pokeball. Legend described it as devastatingly powerful. It had been contained for a reason. Lileep and Cradily carried one of the most counterintuitive type combinations possible. Grass and rock types together generated more weaknesses than almost any other combination in the game, and yet the actual number of weaknesses for that line was only 4. The defensive properties of the two types worked together to cancel out what the other left open, until only fighting, bug, steel, and ice could reliably penetrate. Cradley's actual eyes were located not in the obvious place, the patterned markings on its forehead, but in the dark strip near the base of its head. Most players looked at the wrong part of its face. Anorith and Armaldo shared something with their fossil counterparts that made them stand out among ancient water types. They were the only Pokémon weak to water that could also have the ability Swift Swim, which increased their speed in rain. The rain that could hurt them was also the condition that made them faster, a creature capable of outrunning the thing that endangered it. Armaldo carried a small error into the remakes of the Hoenn games. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, it could learn the move Slash twice, once at level 25 and again at level 34. The same move appearing twice in a learnable move list was not intended and was never corrected in those versions. Armaldo simply learned Slash, forgot it existed, and then learned it again 9 levels later. Phoebus was the rarest wild encounter in the Generation 3 games. On Route 119, it appeared only in 6 specific water tiles out of 436 total. On Mount Coronet in later games, only 4 tiles out of 528. And within those tiles, its encounter rate was only 50%. A player could stand in the right place and still not see it. It became the subject of entire community efforts, players comparing notes about which tiles had worked for them, sharing information the way people share directions to a place most have never been. Melodic could not be found directly. It had to be grown from Phoebus, which was hidden, and the process of evolving Phoebus required raising its beauty stat in Generation 3, which required specific Pokeblocks made from specific berries blended in a specific way. The transformation from Phoebus into Melodic was designed to mirror the transformation in the fairy tale of the Ugly Duckling, and the journey to achieve it reinforced that story. Something rare and difficult becoming something recognized as beautiful through patient, deliberate effort. Melodic's beta design was more serpentine and monstrous than the final version. Early development materials showed a sea creature with a more threatening head, something closer to the classic Western image of a sea monster. The final design shifted toward a siren or mermaid aesthetic, something elegant and graceful. The shift was intentional and connected to Melodic's narrative role. A Pokémon meant to represent transformation from humble to magnificent could not have a menacing face. It needed to be beautiful in a way that felt like an arrival, not a threat. Castform's alternate forms lacked shiny variants for years after the game's release. The sunny, rainy, and snowy forms of Castform had no shiny equivalent until a specific event in Pokemon Go finally introduced them. For most of the game's existence, those forms existed in only one color, unchanging regardless of what the player might have hoped. Kecleon appeared in the Mystery Dungeon games as one of the hardest Pokemon to recruit. The player had to reach level 90 or higher and hold a specific item called the Friend Bow to even attempt recruitment, and then the success rate was 0.1%, 1 in 1,000. Kecleon waited at the end of that difficulty and offered itself only to those who had come that far and still tried. Shuppet carried a theory about its origins. The belief was that Shuppet was born from a specific combination of a dark cloth item and the emotion attached to someone who wore or carried it. The Reaper cloth appeared in the games as an evolutionary item for a different Pokemon, but the theory placed it at the beginning of Shuppet's existence rather than the end of something else's. An object with enough history becoming a creature with its own. Banette was an abandoned toy, a plush doll discarded by the child who had once loved it. According to its Pokédex entries, the creature that emerged from that abandonment was still looking for the child who had left it behind. The purpose of its existence was to find the source of its pain. It was a small and specific kind of haunting, and the game offered it without sentimentality. The doll existed. It was still searching. Duskull appeared in a trading card dabbing. The image circulated widely among fans for whom the juxtaposition of a ghost Pokemon and a dance move from the early 2000s was immediately and completely funny. Dusclops carried its own quiet detail in its shiny coloration. The blue and yellow of the shiny form was thought to reference the Shoshinobake, a haunted paper lantern from Japanese folklore, a glowing thing animated by the same principle that animated all ghost types, the accumulation of feeling in something that was once merely an object. Tropius grew fruit around its neck. Its Pokédex entries clarified that the fruit it grew was not limited to bananas, which was the obvious interpretation, but instead reflected whatever the individual Tropius preferred most. A Tropius that loved watermelon could, in theory, grow watermelons around its neck. The image was impractical and enormous, and the game offered it cheerfully. Chimecho could produce 7 distinct cries, each one corresponding to one of the 7 musical notes, A through G. It was a Pokemon that carried a scale inside it, a wind chime capable of every note of the octave. The sound it made was shaped by something internal, by a musical structure that the game did not ask the player to notice, but placed there regardless. Absol appeared in places where disasters were about to occur, not because it caused them, but because it could sense them approaching and moved toward the disturbance the way a needle moves toward north. In Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Absol appeared near a lake, where Team Galactic would later attempt to capture a legendary Pokemon. In Pokemon Sun and Moon, it appeared in the Tapu village, which had been destroyed years earlier by Tapu Bulu. Absol was always in the neighborhood of what had happened or was about to. Winot could only be found in the Hoenn games on Mirage Island. Mirage Island appeared with a probability of 1 in 10,000 on any given day in the game. A player with a full party of 6 Pokemon, all with the right internal values, could walk to the shore and find an island that most players never saw at all. Winot lived there, patient and unlikely, waiting on an island that barely existed. Snorant was said to bring good fortune to the homes it visited. This belief was well established in the world of the anime, and it had consequences. Poachers actively hunted Snorant to sell them to people who wanted the good luck they were thought to carry. The fortune that surrounded Snorant had made it unsafe. Something believed to be lucky had become valuable enough to be dangerous. Glalie, the final form of Snorant, could not learn the move Attract, which required the user to have a face capable of charming opponents. Glally had a face technically, but it was entirely ice. The move that worked through the expression of feeling had no surface to work from on a creature made of frozen stone. Meanwhile, Smoochum, a small baby Pokémon associated with kissing and affection, could learn Attract without difficulty. The distinction the game drew between those two creatures said something quiet about what charm required. Cielio appeared in a version of itself that was stranger than the one that shipped. Early beta designs gave it features associated more with rodents than with seals, prominent front teeth and fluffy arrangements around its face that made it look closer to a hamster or a guinea pig than to the pinnipeds it was based on. The final design removed those features and leaned into the seal identity fully, including the plush round fur typical of young fur seals before their coats fully mature. The rodent had been inside the seal briefly, and then the seal had reasserted itself. Walrein extended the seal line into something larger, and its presence in the beta files showed smaller differences than its pre-evolutions. The theory about how the rodent-like teeth of early Cielio might have grown into tusks, creating a visual through line from one form to the next, was abandoned in the final design. A straightforward biological progression from seal to walrus was chosen instead. The visual logic became simpler and more legible. Clamperl held pearls that Pokédex entries described as potentially more than 10 times the value of a Shelder's pearl. In the game's economy, pearls existed as sellable items. The regular pearl and the big pearl were significantly more. The distinction Clamperl's entry drew between its pearls and a Shelder's might have been describing exactly that difference, a game mechanic translated into world building through the voice of the Pokédex. Huntail and Goribus occupied the same island in the anime, living on opposite shores with communities of fans devoted to each. A young trainer on Island B would defend Huntail, while a trainer on Island C would defend Goribus with equal fervor. The rivalry between them mirrored Zangoose and Seviper in structure, two creatures placed in permanent opposition by the logic of the world around them. Both were described in their Pokédex entries as draining the fluids of their prey with long, narrow mouths. The elegance of Goribus and the unsettling quality of Huntail shared the same underlying method. Relicanth had not changed in 100 million years. Its Pokédex entries made this point clearly and without embellishment. The same body, the same form, 100 million years of geological time moving around a creature that had found its shape and kept it. It was described as the perfect Pokémon in the sense that it had reached an equilibrium with its environment so complete that improvement became unnecessary. Luvdisk was not strong. Its stats outside of speed were low enough that it rarely appeared in competitive teams, rarely earned serious consideration. And yet in the anime, a gym leader named Hoenn used one against Ash's Grovel in a type matchup that should have been immediately decisive, a water type against a grass type, with the type advantage in Grovel's favor, and somehow the Luvdisk held its own, long enough to make the battle meaningful. The game's numbers said one thing, and the anime did something else, and neither apologized. Bagan spent its early life jumping from cliffs. According to its Pokédex entries, it dreamed of flying and threw itself into the air repeatedly, hoping that the dream would become possible through sheer repetition of effort. The impact of each fall hardened its skull over time, which explained its ability Rockhead, a capacity to take recoil damage without sustaining it. The pain of failing had become the armor of trying. Shelgon appeared in Drake's team at a level beyond where it should have been able to evolve. The Elite Four's Dragon Specialist had a Shelgon at level 52, and Shelgon's natural evolution point was level 50. The game offered no explanation for why this Shelgon had remained in its cocoon-like form past the moment it should have emerged. It simply had, and Drake carried it anyway. Salamence appeared in the Pokémon Adventures manga in a moment that explained something about Ruby, The player character of Ruby and Sapphire. A wild salamence attacked Ruby and Sapphire when they were young, leaving a scar on Ruby's face. The hat that Ruby wore in the games concealed that scar. The detail was never mentioned in the main game itself. It arrived through another medium, another way of telling the story, and it changed the meaning of something players had seen for years without understanding. Beldum and its evolutionary line held the lowest catch rate available outside of legendary Pokémon, 3. Every legendary and mythical Pokémon in the game shared a catch rate of 3, the minimum value, the closest the game could express to uncatchable without making it mechanically impossible. Beldum, Metang, and Metagross shared that number with Kyogre and Groudon and Rayquaza. The Steel and Psychic line was coded with the difficulty of something that should not be containable. Metagross was the result of 4 Beldum fused together, across 2 generations of combination. 1 Beldum became Metang when 2 Beldum merged. 2 Metang became Metagross when they fused in turn. The final form carried the combined intelligence of 4 separate organisms, a supercomputer assembled from smaller units the way cells assemble into tissue. In the anime, Metagross appeared in shiny form more than any other Pokémon, with documented appearances in Nurse Joy's story and in Steven's team during the Mega Evolution special episodes. Regirock's in-game footprint resembled a scarab, the beetle considered sacred in ancient Egyptian culture. The connection between a creature assembled from rock and the symbol of sacred transformation was never made explicit in any Pokédex entry, but it was there in the image of the footprint, carried quietly in a detail most players never examined. Regis appeared to respond to being touched in Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Something in its programming or its story responded to the sensations of contact, which was unusual for a creature made entirely of ice. The ice that could not melt in any circumstances the game provided was also the ice that knew when it was being touched. Registeel's cry in the anime sounded like a DJ turntable. The comparison was widely agreed upon by those who heard it, a mechanical spinning sound in the middle of a world where most Pokémon cried in tones that suggested living creatures. Registeel sounded like equipment. It was appropriate and also immediately memorable. Latias was one of 2 Pokémon in the anime that developed a genuine attachment to Ash. The other was Ash's Bayleaf. Latias appeared in a film set in an ancient city above the water, and in the film's ending it disguised itself as a human character and kissed Ash directly. The implication sat in the film without being addressed. The other romantic presence in Ash's story, Serena, was also cited in this connection, which gave the moment a slightly wider context without resolving anything. Latios and Latias were both described in their designs as resembling jets. Their body shapes were aerodynamic. Their posture in flight was forward-leaning and precise, and yet their speed stats in the games placed them below Purugly, a normal type cat Pokémon known primarily for being heavy and slow. The design said one thing, the number said another. Kyogre and Groudon contained one of the more unusual facts tucked into the anime's interpretation of these Pokémon. In the Pokémon Generations episode depicting the moment of Kyogre's awakening, Primal Kyogre emerged from the depths and rose into the sky above the ocean it had flooded, hovering in the air above the waves. A water-type Pokémon that could, in at least one rendering of the story, fly. Groudon shared its height with Arbok, one of the most ancient and powerful Pokémon in the Hoenn mythology, stood exactly as tall as a large snake, 11 feet and 6 inches, which was a number that required several readings to accept. The scale of Groudon in official artwork and in the game's cutscenes suggested something that dwarfed the landscape. The actual measurement, compared to something familiar, produced a strange recalibration. Rayquaza held one of the more absurd competitive facts in the game. In its Mega form, one of the most powerful transformations available in Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Mega Rayquaza had a higher catch rate than Mantike, a babyfish Pokemon that could be found in the wild relatively easily. The form that could end battles with single moves was technically easier to catch than a small coastal creature. The catch rate was a different measurement than power, and sometimes the two moved in opposite directions. Jirachi slept for 1,000 years between each waking period, and during its brief time awake, it was capable of granting wishes. The 3 tags attached to its head were based on tanzaku, strips of paper used to write wishes during the Japanese star festival Tanabata, also called Tanabata, or the Star Festival. The festival took place on the 7th day of the 7th month, and Jirachi's waking period lasted for 7 days. The 7 was not accidental. The design reached back to the festival that inspired it and borrowed its number. Deoxys was a Hoenn Pokémon that first appeared in a Kanto game. When it was distributed as an event Pokémon in Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the date was August 31st, 2004, 2.5 weeks before Pokémon Emerald, the game it was associated with, had been released in Japan. It arrived in the earlier region before the later game was available, crossing backward through the geography of the franchise in a way that made its origin somewhat ambiguous. The Regi trio arrived in Hoenn behind a puzzle that required understanding Braille, sealed chambers and stone walls, and a sequence of actions the games described in encoded ancient script. They were meant to feel old, older than the rest of the region, older than the routes and the trainers and the ordinary rhythm of encounters. They were something that had been there before the game was, and that would be there after it ended. The legendaries of Hoenn were connected to each other in ways the game made explicit through its story. Groudon and Kyogre represented land and sea, expansion and containment, forces that balanced each other when the third force existed between them. Rayquaza descended to end their conflict. The arrangement was mythological in structure, a story about forces that existed before people and would exist after them, using weather and ocean and continental shift as their medium. The Hoenn region carried water differently than any other region before it. More water routes, more aquatic encounters, more moments where the game placed a player in an ocean that felt genuinely large. The Pokemon that inhabited those routes reflected that emphasis. Tentacool and Tentacruel appeared everywhere, unavoidable in the surf. The water was populated densely, and the Pokemon made the density feel appropriate. The legendary birds of Hoenn, Latios, and Latias moved across the region differently than the land-bound creatures. They roamed. In certain games, they could be found anywhere in the region, appearing and disappearing from the map, requiring either patience or a specific piece of equipment to track. The roaming mechanic created a quality of absence in the game, the sense that something was out there somewhere and could not quite be pinned down. The Pokédex entries of Hoenn Pokémon carried a consistent willingness to go somewhere dark when the creature required it. Beautifully stabbed and drained, Cascoon remembered pain. Banette hunted its abandoned child. Duskull frightened children until they cried. The world of Hoenn held its gentle creatures and its troubling ones with equal matter-of-factness, presenting both without apology. Gym leaders in Hoenn carried distinct personalities that came through in their Pokemon choices as much as in their words. Brawly's surf location made him feel remote. Flannery's inexperience made her sympathetic. Norman, the player's father, appeared as an obstacle before he appeared as a person, and defeating him carried a specific emotional weight that most gym battles did not. The structure of the game had been arranged so that beating one's own parent was a necessary step on the path forward. Team Magma and Team Aqua occupied a region that had made the water versus land conflict its thematic center, and the game was honest about the fact that neither team was entirely wrong in its goals. Both wanted to expand something they valued. Both were willing to cause tremendous harm in service of that expansion. The villain of each version of the game depended on which version was being played, and neither the expanded ocean nor the expanded land turned out to be what the world needed. Wally's journey through the game was quiet and persistent. He appeared early, received a waltz with the player's help, and then moved through the game at his own pace. When he appeared at the end of Victory Road, his team had grown into something formidable. The player who had helped him catch that first waltz found him again at the edge of the most difficult part of the journey, ready to see how far they had both come. The contests in Hoenn were the first time Pokémon was asked to be something other than a battle system. Beauty, coolness, toughness, cleverness, cuteness. The 5 categories created a structure that valued things the battle system ignored. A Pokémon that was mechanically mediocre in battle might have been spectacular in a Pokémon contest, and that possibility opened the game toward players who were not primarily interested in who could hit hardest. The Pokéblock system in Hoenn required social participation. Berries were grown and blending was done more effectively with human partners than alone. The game encouraged sitting with others and making something together, which was an unusual thing for a game to ask. The results of that collaboration fed into another system, which fed into the contest outcomes, which produced ribbons that could be displayed on a Pokémon's summary screen as small, permanent records of what had been accomplished. The battle frontier in Pokémon Emerald extended the endgame into something close to infinite. 7 different facilities, each with its own rules, its own challenges, its own measure of what it meant to succeed. Players who had beaten the game's story found an entirely different game waiting for them, one built not around a narrative, but around sustained excellence under changing conditions. The frontier brain at the end of each facility represented a level of difficulty that many players never reached. The remake of Hoenn in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire restored everything that had existed in the original games and added layers above it. Mega Evolution was introduced in that generation, and its mechanics gave existing Pokémon new forms, new stats, new type combinations in some cases. The Hoenn story was retold with those new forms present, and the legendaries of the region received primal forms that felt like something being restored to an older, deeper version of itself. Soaring in the sky was a new feature in the remakes, allowing players to fly above the region in a way that previous games had only gestured toward. From above, the shape of Hoenn became visible as a coherent geography, the arrangement of routes and cities and water visible all at once. The Mirage Islands and Mirage Spots added something unreachable by ordinary means, places that appeared only under specific conditions and disappeared when those conditions passed. The Delta episode in the remakes extended the story into something that addressed the larger context of the game's world: a meteor, the alignment of forces, the appearance of a Deoxys with a specific history. The ending of the Delta episode placed the player in a position that felt genuinely mythological, at the center of something that the game's ordinary mechanics had not prepared them for. It was a conclusion that reached further than most players expected from a Pokémon game. The music of Hoenn carried the region's character as faithfully as its visual design. The town themes varied in texture, from the sparse and coastal sound of Dewford to the volcanic pulse of Laveridge, from the mechanical hum of Rustboro to the eerie repetition of Fortree. The route themes moved the player forward without urgency, providing a pace that matched the landscape, and the legendary encounters arrived with music that felt ancient, like something that had been playing in a sealed room for a very long time. Little Root Town had no theme of its own, not in the traditional sense, but it opened in quiet, in a moving truck, in the sounds of a new beginning rather than an established place. The theme that eventually played was minimal and warm and appropriate for something that had not yet become home. By the end of the game, the player would have traveled through every corner of Hoenn and returned, and Little Root would mean something different than it had at the beginning. The relationships between Pokémon in Hoenn extended beyond species rivalries and evolutionary connections. Pokémon appeared in specific locations for reasons that the game occasionally explained, and sometimes left to implication. Certain routes carried certain types because the environment suited them. Others carried Pokémon whose presence raised questions the Pokédex would eventually try to answer. The world had been built with enough internal logic that inconsistencies stood out, and inconsistencies were worth noticing. The Safari Zone in Hoenn was accessible in later games in modified forms, but the structure of the region in the original games placed its rare encounters in different contexts. Mirage Island for Winot, specific deep grass patches for creatures that appeared nowhere else, the rarity of Phoebus in its 6 tiles out of hundreds. The design deliberately made some Pokémon difficult to find, not as frustration, but as a quality that attached significance to the finding. Something that appeared everywhere was something different from something that appeared only here. The Pokédex in Generation 3 was the first to separate the regional and national entries, requiring the player to encounter Pokémon from outside Hoenn before the national Pokédex would activate. Until that moment, the world of the game contained only Hoenn, only its 135 Pokémon, only its specific geography. The activation of the national Pokédex was a moment of the world becoming larger, of the map revealing that what had seemed complete was actually only one piece of something much more extensive. Hidden Power was a move in Hoenn's era that functioned differently for every Pokémon that learned it. The type it took was determined by the same hidden values that governed Wurmple's evolution, internal numbers invisible to the player. A Pokémon's hidden power might be fire or grass or electric, or any of 16 other types, determined at the moment the Pokémon was generated and unchanged from that moment forward. Players used external calculators to determine what type a given Pokémon's hidden power was, and then bred for the combination they wanted. The move rewarded knowing what the game was not showing. Secret bases were introduced in Generation 3 and allowed players to claim a patch of wall or a hollow tree and fill it with decorations. The bases could be visited by other players in link cable multiplayer, and flags could be captured from other bases. The social dimension of the game extended into physical space, claimed and decorated by the player, a small piece of the world that was genuinely theirs. The Pokémon Amy feature that would arrive in later games and the affection mechanic that governed certain battle behaviors had early precedence in Hoenn's Pokémon refresh mechanics in the remakes. Feeding a Pokémon Poképuffs, petting it, cleaning it after battle, these actions raised something the game measured and rewarded in specific ways. The chance of surviving a hit that should have been fatal, the chance of shaking off a status condition, the chance of landing a critical hit at a moment that mattered. Affection had mechanical weight in Hoenn when the remakes made it available. The berry system in Generation 3 introduced growth cycles, soil, and weather sensitivity into the cultivation of items. Berries grew over real-world hours when the game was running, ripening according to timers that the player had to check. Some berries grew more of themselves when properly watered, and some dwindled to a single fruit if neglected. The care of berries was a small, persistent responsibility that the game wove into the world alongside everything else. What made Hoenn last beyond the mechanics and the creatures and the music was the quality of attention that had been paid to its design. Each Pokémon in the region existed with a reason. Each location carried something specific to it. The route between Slateport and Mauville felt different from the route between Fallarbor and Rustboro, and those differences were not random. They were the result of sustained thought about what each part of the region should feel like, what the player should be thinking about as they moved through it. The 135 Pokémon of Hoenn were not a random collection. They were an argument about what a region could be, about how many ways a creature could be interesting, about what level of detail was possible in the space a Pokémon game occupied. Some were simple. Wingull was a seagull with a pouch beak. Surskit was a water skater, and simplicity carried its own value, the value of being immediately understood. Others were layered in the way Metagross was layered, 4 separate organisms resolved into one superintelligence, a design that revealed more the longer it was considered. The roots of Hoenn carried their own quiet rhythms, each one shaped by what the land required. Route 119 was long and wet, perpetually drenched in rainfall that made its tall grass shimmer and its water tiles reflect a gray and overcast sky. It was the route where Phoebus hid in its 6 tiles among hundreds, where the weather station stood at the northern end as a reminder that even in a region where legendary Pokémon controlled climate, human beings were still paying attention and trying to understand what the sky intended. Route 120 followed and felt calmer, as if crossing from one into the other involved crossing some threshold between chaos and order. Route 121 was where the Safari Zone sat in the original games, a familiar landmark from other regions translated into Hoenn's landscape and filled with creatures specific to this region's biology. Players moved through it with the same time pressure and mechanical constraints that Safari Zones had always imposed, and the familiar format in unfamiliar territory created a particular kind of tension. Knowing the rules did not make the encounters easier. It only meant the frustration arrived already understood. The sky pillar rose above everything else, vertically unreachable by normal means, until the crumbling tiles of its upper floors were navigated carefully, each step a risk of falling back to a lower level. It was the only way to reach Rayquaza in the original games, and the design of the approach felt deliberate. Something that lived that high above the world should not be easy to reach. The architecture of the ascent should cost something. The Pokémon League in Hoenn stood on an island at the end of Victory Road, accessible only after the player had crossed one of the most demanding caves in the game. The Elite Four waited with teams built around types that created specific strategic problems. Sydney used dark types, Phoebe used ghost types, Glacia used ice types, Drake used dragon types, and champion Steven Stone used a team built around steel and rock types, the metallic and geological things that endured. His Metagross, the centerpiece of that team, carried the weight of everything the game had built toward. Wallace replaced Steven in Pokémon Emerald, the only game in the Hoenn set that changed the champion entirely. His team was water, which was appropriate for the region that had prioritized the ocean above all else. But more than that, Wallace had already been encountered earlier in the game as a gym leader, which meant the player had some knowledge of his Pokémon, some expectation of his style. The familiarity made the champion battle different in tone, an encounter with someone already known rather than someone encountered for the first time at the end of everything. The post-game of the original games led to the Battle Tower, and the post-game of Emerald led to the Battle Frontier. Both rewarded continued engagement with the systems the game had spent its story teaching. The Frontier, specifically, was built around encountering those systems in unusual configurations, under rules that prevented the strategies that worked everywhere else. It was a test of understanding rather than power, and it separated players who had learned the surface of the game from those who had learned what was underneath. The Trick House in Hoenn appeared as a small building on Route 110, unremarkable from the outside. Inside, a series of puzzles waited across multiple visits, each one more complex than the last, each one requiring the player to have achieved a certain point in the main story before the next one would be available. The reward was small by the standards of the game's later challenges, but the Trick House was beloved, and the Trick Master himself was beloved, a strange and enthusiastic character who hid in his own house and left notes for the player who found him. The abandoned ship appeared on water routes between cities and was filled with both trainable Pokémon and narrative traces of the people who had once been aboard it. Documents and cabin keys told a fragmentary story about passengers and crew, about a journey that had ended without the ships reaching wherever it was going. The atmosphere of it was unusual for Hoenn, quieter and more melancholic than the game's otherwise bright and adventurous tone. A ruined ship full of ghost Pokémon and wet footprints and rooms that used to belong to someone. Mount Pyre sat above the sea with an exterior and an interior that carried different qualities. Outside, Pokémon associated with darkness and the strange could be found in the tall grass on its slopes. Inside, it was a place of memorials, of small stones, and the presence of something being honored. The old couple at the summit kept the red and blue orbs, and their loss when the villains took them was a moment when the game's stakes became something personal rather than global. Two elderly people had been guarding something for a long time, and they had been overwhelmed. Team Aqua's submarine base and Team Magma's volcanic lair both required the player to navigate through spaces that felt like they belonged to the villains, not to the protagonist. Hoenn's villains had built things, not just assembled things. The bases had architecture and function. They felt occupied. Moving through them required paying attention to guards and puzzles and the geometry of spaces designed to exclude intruders. The player was the intruder. The Cave of Origin appeared in both versions of the original game, but led to different places. In Sapphire, it led to Kyogre. In Ruby, it led to Gruden. In Emerald, it was not the primary encounter location for either of them. The cave existed in the center of Sotopolis City, which existed inside a crater in the middle of the sea, which was only accessible through underwater tunnels. The layers of approach created a geography of importance, each barrier increasing the significance of what waited at the center. Sotopolis itself was one of the most unusual city designs in the franchise's history. A crater lake with houses built on its interior slopes, no routes leading to it from the surface, accessible only by diving or by flight if the player already knew where to look. It existed inside the world without being connected to the world in the ordinary way. The gym was there, and the Cave of Origin was there, and everything about its location said that this was the place the game considered most important. Pacific Town floated on logs lashed together above the ocean, with no land beneath it and no roads connecting it to the mainland. It could be reached from the east or west by surfing, and it contained the entrance to the current that led to the Sky Pillar, a town without ground, built over deep water, full of people who had chosen to live above the ocean on a structure that moved with it. The old woman inside who gave away TM that depended on happiness was a small detail in the middle of an unusual place. Slateport City contained the museum and the shipyard, two buildings that placed Hoenn's culture and its economy into the landscape. The stern in the museum and the Devon Corporation materials in the shipyard connected the region's present to its history of seafaring and industry. The market along the beach, where trainers gathered and sold and bought from each other, was a space that felt genuinely mercantile, genuinely alive in the way that port cities feel alive when commerce is moving through them. Mauville City sat at Hoenn's center, the hub that connected north to south, east to west. Its bike path extended to the right, which gave access to the coastal areas of the east. The game corner was there, and Watson's electric-type gym, in the sense that this was the place where the map pivoted. The remakes rebuilt Mauville City entirely, turning it into an enclosed shopping mall that occupied the ground level of what had once been an open city, raising the sky above it into an interior. The change was significant, and responses to it were divided. Lavaridge Town arrived after a volcanic ascent, Mount Chimney and Jagged Pass, both requiring climbing before the hot springs of Lavaridge were accessible. The hot springs were the center of the town's identity, healing Pokémon and giving the settlement a reason to exist in the shadow of an active volcano. Flannery's gym was a maze of hot springs and warp tiles, the fire-type gym appropriately uncomfortable to navigate. The egg given in a house adjacent to the gym would eventually become Winot, which would eventually evolve into Wobbuffet, which was the opposite of dramatic in the most endearing possible way. Falliber Town felt like a place that existed because volcanic ash had created a kind of community around its shared inconvenience. The contest hall there was a surprising feature for a town that seemed designed around hardship rather than leisure. The old man who investigated meteor fragments was there, and his presence connected Falliber to the outer space elements of the game's mythology, to Jirachi and Deoxys, and the Delta episode that the remakes would eventually build around. Verdanturf Town was small and pale and filled with the sound of wind through grasslands. The tunnel being cleared by a young man who wanted to visit someone on the other side was a quiet subplot that asked nothing of the player but could be completed for a reward and a small story. The couple who were separated by the cave, the tunnel that allowed them to meet, the town that sat on one side of the mountain that sat between them. It was a very small love story in the middle of a game about legendary Pokémon. The berry blending in Hoenn required players to coordinate button presses with on-screen prompts while sitting in the berry blender with others, either human or computer-controlled Sonia PCs. The resulting Pokéblock had different qualities depending on how well the blending had gone, and those qualities fed directly into the beauty, coolness, cuteness, toughness, and cleverness stats that Pokémon contests measured. The chain from berry to blended item to contest stat to ribbon was long and required sustained attention across multiple systems, and players who understood all of it held a meaningful advantage in the contest hall. The Pokémon fan base engaged deeply with Hoenn's secondary systems in ways that reflected genuine investment in the game as a designed object. The discovery of Mirage Island's conditions was a community effort, with players comparing game data and sharing what they had tried. The mapping of Phoebus tiles on Route 119 was similarly collaborative, a project that required many players checking many tiles because the arrangement changed with each new game. No single player could do it alone in reasonable time. The community became part of the game's solution. Pokémon trading across Hoenn and beyond required link cables in the original games and a wireless adapter in later ones. The social infrastructure of trading was built into the game's Pokédex completion requirements, with version exclusives demanding that players either trade with someone who had the other game or find another way to access what they couldn't catch on their own. The GTS that appeared in later generations made trading asynchronous and global, but the original Hoenn trade required proximity and intentionality. The Battle Frontier's individual facilities each rewarded a different kind of mastery. The Battle Factory presented rental Pokémon and required the player to build a functioning team from unfamiliar options, testing adaptability rather than preparation. The Battle Pike placed the player in a building where each room offered choices with unknown consequences, combining strategy with information management. The Battle Dome ran like a tournament, with advancing brackets and opponents who used different Pokémon in each round. The Battle Arena judged Pokémon on their actions rather than simply on whether they won or lost. The Battle Palace required trusting Pokémon to act according to their own natures rather than player commands. The Battle Pyramid placed the player in darkness, requiring navigation by memory and the gradual recovery of light as the floor progressed. And the Battle Tower, which had existed in a simpler form in Johto, was here again with the familiar goal of consecutive wins and the familiar question of how far a team could go. The frontier brain that ended each facility was a specific character with a specific name and a specific personality expressed through their facility's design. Tucker and his theatrical presentation, Greta and her focus on effort, Spencer and his philosophy of trusting his Pokémon to act as themselves, Annabelle and her psychic connection to her team, Lucy and her snake-like composure, Brandon and his Ragey trio, and Noland, the factory head who was said to have befriended a legendary Pokémon he had encountered in the facility. Each of them was a statement about what the frontier valued. The island challenge of the Pokémon world had not yet arrived in Hoenn, but Hoenn's island geography anticipated it. 7 islands could be reached by surf or by diving, and each had something specific to offer. The pattern of hidden locations, requiring navigation through water, suggested a design philosophy that would eventually become something more formalized in later games. The sea was not just decoration in Hoenn, it was the space between things, and the things in between were worth finding. The legendary birds of Kanto did not appear in Hoenn, but their absence shaped the game. The Hoenn region introduced an entirely new set of legendary Pokémon, including the 2 Eon Pokémon, the Regi Trio, and the Weather Trio, without needing to reach back to earlier generations for weight or significance. The game trusted its own mythology. The new legendaries had to carry their meaning without the borrowed authority of creatures that had come before them. The Eon Ticket event distributed Latios or Latias to players who had not obtained them through the story. In the version where one was encountered roaming, the other was available through this method, making both accessible within a single game's playthrough. The event Pokémon carried something of the legitimacy of official distribution, of a moment when the game reached outside its own borders and placed something in the hands of a player who had gone to find it. The design of Pokémon battles in Generation 3 introduced abilities as a core mechanical element for the first time. Previous generations had given Pokémon stats, types, and moves, but no passive trait that operated independently of those 3 things. Abilities changed what was possible in fundamental ways. Intimidate lowered the opponent's attack when the Pokémon entered battle. Levitate gave immunity to ground-type moves to Pokémon that hovered. Trace copied the opponent's ability, creating information gathering and mirror scenarios that had not previously existed. Static gave Pokémon with the ability a chance to paralyze anything that made physical contact with them. The mechanics of battle became more complex and more interesting, and the Pokémon of Hoenn were the first to carry these new layers into the world. Double battles also arrived in Generation 3 and changed the strategic landscape in ways that single battles could not accommodate. 2 Pokémon on each side, moves that could hit both opponents or both allies or specific targets, abilities that interacted between partners. The combo of Sunny Day and Chlorophyll, the interplay of Earthquake hitting both opponents while a partner with Levitate remained untouched, the possibility of using moves that affected one's own partner to create effects that could not be achieved alone. Slaking under the skill swap that Norman used in the manga was a double battle solution, and double battles created many others. The introduction of natures in Generation 3 tied personality language to mechanical stat modification. A brave nature boosted attack and lowered speed. A modest nature boosted special attack and lowered attack. A jolly nature boosted speed and lowered special attack. 25 different natures, each pair of modifications creating a character in the stat distribution of a Pokémon, a hint at something like personality expressed through numbers. Players breeding for competitive teams sought specific natures alongside specific moves and specific hidden values, and the complexity of preparation became a significant part of the game's depth. The effort value system in Generation 3 was rebuilt from the foundations that earlier games had established. In the new system, Pokémon gained specific EV points from defeating specific Pokémon, and those points translated directly into stat bonuses at level 100, with each 4 EVs translating to 1 stat point. The maximum was 510 total EVs, with a cap of 255 in any single stat, though optimal distribution placed 252 in 2 stats and 6 in a third. Players who understood this system had access to a layer of customization that was invisible to those who did not, a difference between a Pokémon trained arbitrarily and a Pokémon built for a specific purpose. Individual values, or IVs, operated alongside EVOs as a second hidden layer. Each Pokémon was generated with values from 0 to 31 in each of its 6 stats, determining its potential ceiling. A Pokémon with 31 in its speed stat would be faster at any given level than an identical Pokémon with 20 in speed. Breeding allowed players to select for specific IVs across generations of offspring, using Pokémon with high IVs in specific stats as parents to pass those values to their children. The system rewarded sustained engagement with the breeding mechanics, and players who invested in it built teams that performed measurably better than those who did not. The Everstone held a specific role in this breeding system. A Pokémon holding it would pass its nature to its offspring with 50% probability, allowing players to stabilize the personality trait they wanted across breeding generations. The hold item that prevented evolution became a tool for inheritance, a small object with 2 entirely different uses, depending on context. Evolution stopped, or nature passed, the same stone serving opposite purposes depending on when it was held. Pokéris was a condition introduced in Generation 2 that remained present in Generation 3 and carried a rate of occurrence low enough that many players never encountered it naturally. A Pokémon infected with Pokéris gained double the effort values from every battle until the infection passed, which happened after a set number of days, unless the Pokémon was stored in the box. The condition could spread between Pokémon in the active party, and players who discovered a Pokéris infection immediately boxed one carrier to preserve the dormant form indefinitely. It was a positive status condition that the game presented in the same notification style as a negative one, which caused alarm before understanding arrived. The connection between Generation 3 and the games that came before it was intentionally limited at launch. Ruby and Sapphire could not trade or battle with Gold, Silver, Crystal, Red, Blue, or Yellow. The leap in hardware and the changed data structures made direct compatibility impossible, and the decision to sever that connection created a clean break that isolated Hoenn's launch from everything that had existed before it. Fire Red and Leaf Green reconnected players to Kanto and eventually to Pokémon from earlier generations, and Emerald's additional trading support filled in more of the gap. But for the first months of Hoenn's existence, the region stood alone. The Pokénav introduced in Generation 3 allowed players to track the Pokémon they had battled and the condition stars of their team, but it also allowed them to call other trainers and arrange rematches. Trainers who had been defeated in the main story became available again at higher levels through the rematch system, and some of them rotated their teams with time. The Pokénav was a tool of the region, specific to Hoenn, given by Devon Corporation and tied to the game's narrative, rather than arriving as a universal feature. The world of Hoenn had its own technology, and that technology shaped how the player moved through it. The Pokémon contests, in their mechanical depth, required players to build specifically contest-oriented sets of moves alongside their battle moves. A Pokémon used in contests needed moves with high contest appeal and good combinations, and the preparation for contests was separate from and sometimes in conflict with the preparation for battle. A player trying to do both at once would find that the requirements of each system pulled against each other, and choices had to be made about which mattered more. Some Pokémon were used exclusively for contests and never appeared in battle. Others were trained for battle and never brought to a contest hall. The game rewarded specialization while leaving the choice of which kind to the player. The ribbons accumulated through Pokémon contests could be displayed on a Pokémon's summary screen alongside ribbons from battle facilities and from trading with other regions. A Pokémon that had been through everything, through the 8 gyms and the Elite Four, through the contest halls and their ribbon challenges, through the battle frontier and its individual facility requirements, would carry ribbons on its summary that told that entire history in small, square images. The Pokémon's page became a record of everywhere it had been and what had been asked of it. The relationship between a player and a long-trained Pokémon in Generation 3 was mediated through several visible systems and several invisible ones. Friendship affected certain moves' power and certain evolution conditions. Happiness determined whether some Pokémon would evolve at all. The affection system that would arrive in later remakes was not present in the originals, but the framework of caring for Pokémon as something that mattered to the mechanics was already present. A Pokémon that had been mistreated, allowed to faint frequently, given bitter medicines, would have lower happiness and would respond differently than one that had been kept healthy and leveled carefully. The sound design of Generation 3 translated the experience of Hoenn into audio in ways that contributed directly to its atmosphere. The cries of Pokémon were electronic, synthetic, built from samples that had been shaped into something that sounded like what a creature might sound like if creatures were made of digital signal. Some cries became iconic, independent of the Pokémon that made them. Others were memorable for being unusual, like Registeel's turntable sound or the layered electronic pulse of Rayquaza in the anime. The music that played during legendary encounters created a quality of stillness before the battle, a moment of quiet before the theme that signaled something historic was beginning. The visual style of the Pokémon in Generation 3 benefited from the Game Boy Advance hardware in ways that the Game Boy Color had not allowed. More colors, more shading, more detail in the small sprite forms that represented each Pokémon in battle. The front sprites and back sprites were different in their quality, with front sprites usually more polished than the back sprites that the player saw most frequently when their own Pokémon were fighting. The slight inconsistency was noticed and accepted as a feature of the generation, something that would improve in the generations that followed. The mapping of Hoenn across its routes and cities was a specific aesthetic achievement. The region felt simultaneously tropical and mountainous, coastal and volcanic, dense with vegetation in some places and barren in others. Mount Chimney dominated the northern interior, the way an active geological feature dominates a real landscape, unavoidable and significant. The ocean routes, to the south and east, carried the vastness that water routes always created, that sense of space without fixed edges. The forests of the interior held Pokémon that existed in shadow and in the filtered light under canopy. Weather effects in Generation 3 operated across the overworld, as well as in battle, with routes experiencing rain, sandstorm, harsh sunlight, or hail depending on location and game. The weather on Route 120 shifted between sunlight and rain, and the experience of moving through weather that affected battle mechanics was a feature of the game world rather than only of the battle screen. Cast Form, the weather Pokémon, changed its form in response to these conditions, demonstrating in its design what the game was expressing through its mechanics. The world and the battle were connected by the same weather. The dive mechanic introduced in Generation 3 opened the world in a new direction. Surfing had allowed horizontal movement across water. Diving allowed vertical movement downward into it. The underwater areas contained Pokémon, items, and the entrance to Sootopolis City. They also contained a dense growth of seaweed that could be walked through and a quality of darkness and pressure that distinguished the experience of being under the water from being on top of it. The visual palette shifted, the music changed, and the players understood that they had entered a different part of the world by the way it felt to be there. Sealed Cave required diving to reach its entrance and contained the blue orb or red orb depending on the version of the game being played. The experience of descending into the water, finding an opening, ascending into a cave that sat below sea level, and then navigating to a chamber where an ancient object of power was kept, created a sequence of environments that built toward something. Each barrier was also a kind of reverence, each additional step asking the player to understand that what waited at the end had been sealed away for a reason. The Pokémon world in Hoenn contained human characters whose stories extended past their role in the main narrative. Wally's gradual growth has already been mentioned. Professor Birch's research into the Pokémon habitats of Hoenn, rather than their evolution, was a departure from the professors of earlier regions, who all shared Pokémon's evolutionary patterns as their area of specialization. Scott, who appeared throughout the region and observed the players' battles, was building a dossier toward the Battle Frontier invitation that would arrive at the end of the story. Mr. Briney and his Wingle Pico created a small community outside the game's main systems, a retired sailor who had chosen stillness and found it disturbed by the same forces that disturbed everything in Hoenn. The antagonist structure of Hoenn was unusual because it forked. Ruby and Sapphire each presented a primary villain organization with a second organization that appeared but did not dominate. The primary villain sought to either expand the land or the sea, and the secondary organization sought the opposite. In Emerald, both organizations existed simultaneously and worked against each other as much as against the player, and the story was adjusted to reflect a world where neither side's extreme was acceptable and the balance the Pokémon world needed required defeating them both. Archie and Maxie were given redesigns in the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire remakes that made them more visually distinctive and gave them more personality in the dialogue. The expanded story of the remakes treated them as people who genuinely believed in what they were doing rather than simply as obstacles in the player's path. They were wrong in their methods and in their understanding of what awakening a legendary Pokémon would actually produce, but they were not careless. They were mistaken in the way that people who are passionate about something can be mistaken. The Wishing Pokémon Jirachi was accessible through a promotional bonus disc distributed with Pokémon Coliseum in certain regions. A player who had the disc and a copy of Ruby or Sapphire and a link cable and a Game Boy Advance and a GameCube could transfer one Jirachi from the bonus disc to their game. The chain of requirements was long and the window of availability was limited, and many players who wanted Jirachi did not have access to every necessary component at the right time. The rarity of it became part of what it was. Deoxys occupied a different kind of rarity. Its multiple forms, each with a different stat distribution and physical appearance, made it one of the most mechanically complex legendary Pokémon that had been introduced to that point. The normal attack, defense, and speed forms required different games to access, with Fire Red producing the attack form, Leaf Green producing the defense form, and Emerald producing the speed form. The original Ruby and Sapphire produced the normal form. A player who wanted all four forms needed access to 4 different games. The legendary Pokémon of Hoenn each arrived with a specific encounter context designed to make the moment of meeting them feel weighted. Rayquaza at the top of the Sky Pillar, accessible only after crumbling floors and careful navigation. Groudon or Kyogre in the Cave of Origin after the conflict that the game's story had built toward. The Reggie trio behind the Braille puzzle and the specific actions required to open sealed chambers. Latios or Latias roaming across the region, seen in a brief cutscene in Oldale Town, and then spread across the entire map. Each encounter was designed not just as a battle, but as an event with its own atmosphere and its own logic. The Braille messages in the sealed chamber and in the ruins of the Reggie Trio's homes were translated in player communities in the weeks after the game's release. Players who knew Braille could read them directly. Players who didn't found Braille charts and matched the dots. The process of decoding the messages was a shared experience, and the solutions spread through forums and schoolyards, and eventually became documented so completely that later players could look them up in seconds. But the generation that first encountered them remembered the work. Hoenn was the first region to be featured in a Pokémon game with a 3-dimensional overworld when the remakes arrived on the Nintendo 3DS. The transition from the flat, sprite-based map of Ruby and Sapphire to the 3-dimensional environment of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire changed how the region looked without changing what it contained. The same roads, the same cities, the same cave entrances and water passages and mountain slopes. The geometry of it had been preserved, while the rendering of it had become something new. Flying on a Megaladios or Megaladius above Hoenn in the remakes offered a perspective that was not possible in the original games. The soaring mechanic showed the region from above, which revealed relationships between locations that the map had always implied, but that the ground-level movement of earlier games had never shown from this angle. Players could see where the routes bent and how the cities were arranged relative to each other, and what the topology of the region looked like when observed from a height that made it comprehensible all at once. The mirage spots that appeared in the sky during soaring contained legendary Pokémon from other generations, placed in Hoenn's sky as a way of expanding what the remakes offered beyond the content of the original games. Pokémon that had never been available in a Hoenn game became accessible to players who found them in the shifting formations of cloud and light above the region. The sky became another kind of Pokédex, another layer of encounters built above everything the ground already contained. The memory of Hoenn persists for the players who first experienced it as the setting of their first Pokémon game. For some players, Hoenn was where the franchise began, where the language of Pokémon was first learned, where the water routes first seemed enormous, and the legendary encounters first seemed genuinely significant. The region carries that weight for a specific generation of players in a way that no subsequent game can replicate, because there is only one first time. The games that came after offered more. The game that came first offered the beginning. Every fact about the 135 Pokémon of Hoenn is also a fact about the people who made them, who carried them from a sketch to a sprite to a name to a Pokédex entry to a battle that a child somewhere was having on a small rectangular screen in the dark before sleep arrived. The people who decided that Torchic's marking should reference Japanese farming history and that Nuzleaf's flute should appear in the Pokédex, even though it would never appear in the move list. The people who placed Phoebus in 6 tiles and decided that finding it should feel like finding something. The people who built the Braille puzzles and the Sky Pillar floors and the Cave of Origin and the Battle Frontier facilities. The care that went into Hoenn is visible in every detail, in the contradictions and the consistencies, in the moments where the game surprised the player and the moments where it confirmed what the player had already suspected. It is visible in the willingness to hide things and in the willingness to make other things plainly stated. A region that contained deep ocean currents and floating towns and sealed chambers and festival music that powered up a dancing Pokémon had a specific vision of what it wanted to be, and it spent its development achieving that vision one detail at a time. The 135 were not just creatures, they were arguments. Each one argued for a specific way of thinking about what a Pokémon could be, what combination of design and typing and cultural reference and mechanical role could produce something worth caring about. Some of those arguments were simple, some were complex. All of them together formed the larger argument that Hoenn made about itself. It's about the world it had built and the region it had imagined. And the argument is still being made, still being received by every player who opens a Pokémon Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire cartridge and begins again in Little Root Town, in the moving truck, in the quiet opening moment before the region reveals itself, before the music starts, before the first Zigzagoon scatters ahead of Professor Birch, before any of the 135 are known by name. The Pokémon of Hoenn were not designed in isolation from each other. They were imagined as part of an ecosystem, a collection of creatures that would coexist across the same routes and cities and ocean channels, creating a world that felt internally consistent even while being fantastical. When a player surfed across Route 110 and encountered Tentacool in the water, and then stepped onto land and walked through tall grass and found a Meenan in the Blades, both encounters felt like they belonged to the same world. That coherence was the result of deliberate design choices made about what kinds of creatures could live side by side without the combination feeling arbitrary. Wurmple's evolution into 2 different possible forms was an early sign that the game was interested in variation within a single creature's potential. The same Wurmple, under the same conditions, raised with the same care, could become either Silcoon or Beautifully, or Cascoon and Dustox. The divergence was built into the creature at the moment it was generated, invisible, and immutable. 2 players raising Wurmple at the same time would not necessarily raise the same Pokémon, and neither of them could predict at the start which branch the evolution would take. The game introduced genuine uncertainty into a system that usually rewarded knowledge and preparation. The distinction between Silcoon and Cascoon was visual and typological, but not immediately dramatic. Both were cocoons. Both were nearly immobile. Both were waiting. The difference emerged in what they became, Beautifully with its aggressive predatory beauty, Dustox with its defensive poison. The gentler-looking creature became the dangerous one. The one that hid in a shell and remembered pain became the moth with toxic wings. The game reversed the expected relationship between appearance and threat without calling attention to the reversal. Beautifully's design drew from real butterfly biology in ways that carried darkness into a creature that looked entirely decorative. Its compound eyes were built for detection as well as beauty. Its proboscis, the long, narrow structure that extended from its face, was not a passive feature. In nature, butterflies use similar structures to feed on plant fluids, but Beautifully's entries described something more predatory. The design placed a hunting tool inside a beautiful package, and the game's Pokédex was honest about which was more significant to the creature's survival. Masquerain occupied a space between threat and performance. The eye spot patterns on its antenna wings were not real eyes. They were displays, mimicry of something dangerous in order to deter creatures that might otherwise attack. The behavior existed in nature in many insects, and masquerade was built on that biological fact. Its beauty was functional rather than ornamental, a signal designed to be misread. A creature that looked like it had eyes on its wings, but none there survived because other creatures could not be certain of that. Surskit moved on water, using a secretion from its legs, an oily substance that reduced surface tension and allowed it to glide. The science of this was captured in the name and in the design, a small creature making use of a physical property of water rather than fighting against it. Pokémon that engaged with real biological or physical phenomena in their mechanics felt grounded in a way that made them easier to believe in, even within a world where creatures breathed fire and manipulated gravity. The line from Shroomish to Breloom carried one of the more surprising type combinations in the region. Shroomish was a small, round, inoffensive-looking grass type with a face that, viewed upside down, became something else entirely. Breloom took that mild beginning and added fighting type, creating a creature that combined the organic and the martial into something that felt genuinely aggressive. Its mushroom cap and its kangaroo-like build placed two visual ideas next to each other that should not have fit and somehow did. Breloom's spores were poisonous, and its fists were capable of delivering rapid combinations of strikes faster than human vision could track according to its Pokédex entries. The small round mushroom Pokémon had become a boxer with toxic spores and a reach that extended further than its compact frame suggested. The gap between Shroomish and Breloom was one of the wider tonal leaps in a single evolutionary line in the region, a creature that started soft and ended hard. The Shedinja that appeared when Nincada evolved held one of the most mechanically unusual combinations in the game. Its Wonder Guard ability meant that only moves that were super effective against it could cause damage. Nothing else would connect. A Shedinja with the right defensive moves and a patient trainer could be nearly impossible to damage in certain matchups. But its HP was always 1. A single super effective hit ended it. The invulnerability and the fragility existed together, and neither canceled the other. Ninjask moved faster than almost any other Pokémon after it evolved. Its speed stat was one of the highest in the game, and its ability Speed Boost raised that speed further with each passing turn. The contrast between what Nincada had been and what Ninjask became was absolute. The slow, burrowing larva that had emerged into light became a creature that moved faster than thought, its wings producing a sound so high-pitched that it pressed at the edges of hearing. The evolution was not a refinement of Nincada. It was a transformation so complete that the original creature seemed like something from a different story. Loudred and Whismur and Exploud formed an evolutionary line centered on sound in all its uses, from the most delicate to the most overwhelming. Whismur's quiet exterior concealed the beginning of something that would grow louder with each form. Loudred was already capable of producing sound waves powerful enough to affect the inner ear of anyone nearby. Exploud took that further still, its entire body redesigned around the production and direction of sound. The ports and tubes visible in its design were not decoration. They were instruments, but each one contributing to the range and volume of what Exploud could produce. The idea that Exploud was historically used as a communication device between distant cities carried a different weight when considered alongside what Loudred and Whismur were. A creature that started as something almost too quiet to hear had become something loud enough to transmit information across geography. The evolutionary line told a story about volume as a resource, about the relationship between what a creature contained and what it could eventually project into the world. Makuhita's training method was one of the more specific and physical described in any Pokédex entry. It struck the trunks of trees, repeatedly, hardening its body through impact. The version of training it performed was recognizable as a real practice in certain martial arts traditions, where repetitive contact with a hard surface gradually thickens the skin and conditions the underlying tissue. The game placed that practice inside a small round Pokémon and connected it to the eventual emergence of Hariyama, which was large and capable of withstanding tremendous force precisely because it had spent its earlier life inviting impact. The size difference between Makuhita and Hariyama was significant, and the weight distribution in Hariyama's design suggested something about how mass could be centered and used. Its wide stance and the particular way its arms hung from its large shoulders communicated a creature that understood balance, that had learned through the same repetitive training that Makuhita practiced how to keep a center of gravity low and stable. The design carried the training inside it. Azural's large round tail was used as a flotation device, and it could bounce on that tail like a ball. The tail was disproportionately large relative to the rest of its body, and the Pokédex noted that Azural sometimes accidentally flung itself great distances by bouncing too hard. The image of a small, round blue Pokémon unexpectedly launching itself into the air through the enthusiasm of its own bouncing was one of the gentler and more charming details in the Hoenn Pokédex. A creature whose own physicality occasionally surprised it. Nosepass was a navigation instrument as much as it was a Pokémon. Its large, rocky nose was permanently oriented northward by magnetic forces within the earth, and the creature could not turn freely without fighting that orientation. The compass Pokémon was the compass because it could not be anything else. Its design committed it to direction in a way that was not a choice, but a condition. In Pokémon Go, where the game made this behavior visible in real time, the nose turned toward magnetic north even when the player fled from it, demonstrating that the mechanic had been preserved across the translation into a different game format. Skitty's relationship to the Moonstone was complicated by timing in a way that persisted across generations. The stone that would evolve it into Delcatty was never available in the same game where Skitty could be found in the wild. Players who wanted a Delcatty had to either trade a Skitty to a game that had the Moonstone or obtain the stone through other means. In games where Skitty was available, but the stone was not yet accessible, the chain of availability was just long enough to be inconvenient without being impossible, a small obstacle that felt like a design choice about how easily certain evolutions should be obtained. Delcatty's elegance was a point of pride in its design, and that elegance was visible in the smooth, minimal shapes that defined its final form compared to the rounder and more playful Skitty. The evolution represented a kind of refinement, a settling into something more deliberate. Delcatty did not hunt. It did not have a territory. According to its Pokédex entries, it moved constantly without establishing a home, sleeping wherever it found comfortable, following no schedule, and accepting no constraints on its movement. The elegant creature was also entirely without attachment to place. Sableye occupied a unique defensive position in the game before Fairy type was introduced. With Ghost and Dark typing, it had no weaknesses at all. No type in the game could deal super effective damage to it, and many of the most common attack types were entirely ineffective. A Pokémon with no weaknesses but mediocre stats was a curiosity rather than a dominant competitive presence, but the fact of having no weaknesses at all was remarkable. It shared that distinction with only Spiritomb in later games. 2 Pokémon in the entire franchise before Fairy type arrived, and one of them lived in Hoenn. Mawile was the opposite of what it appeared to be. It looked gentle and small, with a face that invited approach. But the structure behind its head, the second set of jaws, was capable of biting through iron bars. The creature's most dangerous feature was also its least visible one, positioned behind it in a place that required proximity before it could be perceived. The Pokédex entries described Mawul as using its gentle face to lure creatures close enough for the steel jaws to act. The deception was part of the design, cuteness as a predatory strategy. The steel jaws of Mawul were based on the Futakuchi Onna of Japanese folklore, a creature described as a woman with a second mouth at the back of her head, hidden under her hair, that demanded food she outwardly refused. The folklore carried themes about concealment and appetite and the things left unseen, and Mawile translated those themes into a small, steel-typed creature that led with its innocent face and followed with its concealed ones. Iran began small and ended enormous. Its evolutionary line moved from a creature small enough to fit in a child's hands to Agron, which stood at over 2 meters and carried 800 pounds of steel and rock plating across its body. The size progression was one of the most dramatic in Hoenn, and the typing remained consistent across the entire line. Steel and rock, the most defensively specialized combination in the game. The defensive profile of the line was exceptional. The offensive moveset included, inexplicably, Surf. The image of Agron surfing was not something the game's battle animations lingered on, but the move list included it regardless. The same creature that could bulldoze through a mountain could also, by the game's mechanics, glide across open water. Whether this was intended as a practical option or simply as a consequence of the move pool being broadly distributed was unclear. The game did not require justification for the moves it gave. It gave them and left the explaining to the imagination. Electrike gathered static electricity in its fur from the moisture in the air, and on dry days the charge built quickly. The metal brush that would shock anyone who used it on Electrike was not a warning about misuse, but about the nature of the creature itself, about what it held inside it. Grooming an Electrike was an act of engagement with something electrically charged, and the consequences were immediate and significant. Manectric intensified that charge into something that its Pokédex described as gathering atmospheric electricity and releasing it in bolts that arrived from the sky rather than from the creature's own body. The regional designs of Hoenn's electric types captured something specific about electricity as an element. It was not containable in the same way that fire or water could be contained. It moved through conductors and resisted insulators and expressed itself in the relationship between itself and the material it encountered. Electric and Manectric were designed around that mobility, around electricity, as something that gathered and discharged rather than something that was stored and aimed. The design philosophy made them feel like phenomena as much as creatures. Pluslo and Minun appeared as a pair that the game expected would be used together. Their abilities, plus and minus, created bonus effects in double battles when a Pokémon with plus was paired with a Pokémon with minus. The mechanical partnerships was built into the design, and the promotional materials for Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire placed them side by side frequently. They were the cheerleaders of the game, creatures designed to support rather than to lead, whose design celebrated that role rather than treating it as a limitation. Volbeat's light signals could communicate with Illuminate in patterns, and together they performed displays in the night sky. The two species were linked by behavior as well as by breeding mechanics, appearing together in the game's environment and sharing the egg pool that allowed their offspring to be each other. The courtship display they performed, Volbeat guiding Illumise with his flashing lights, was described with a specificity that made it feel observed rather than invented, the kind of detail that came from someone who had watched fireflies in warm weather and thought about what Pokémon equivalents of that display might look like. Roselia occupied the same overlap between beauty and danger that several Hoenn Pokémon shared. Its flowers were vivid and aromatic, and they released fragrances that had different qualities depending on context. In good health, Roselia's flowers produced a scent associated with healing. Under stress or threat, the fragrance became toxic. The same flowers, the same creature, the same biological mechanism producing opposite effects depending on the conditions the Pokémon was experiencing. The design made the beauty conditional on the piece of the creature that carried it. Gulpin and Swalot formed a line built around consumption. Gulpin could swallow things larger than itself, stretching to accommodate whatever it was eating. Swalot's design formalized that capacity into something that looked like a container, a purple sac with hair-like protrusions and a constant openness to the possibility of ingestion. The line carried an ecological role as decomposers, creatures that processed what other creatures could not, breaking down and absorbing what the world left behind. The evolutionary line that appeared in Pokémon contests, with festival music playing, was also a creature that ate garbage. Both things were true simultaneously. Carvanha appeared in groups that the Pokédex described as aggressive enough to reduce large metal objects to fragments. A school of Carvanha encountering a ship's hull would over time have nothing left to encounter. The fish that consumed steel was the base form of Sharpedo, which added speed and direction to the Carvanha feeding pattern. Sharpedo did not wait for prey to come to it. It moved toward prey at speeds that made its scarred, powerful body into a projectile. The tournament at Slateport's harbor, the Pokémon contest hall there, the museum and the shipyard, all of it concentrated in a single city, the range of what Hoenn thought was worth organizing into civic space, a market, a museum, a contest venue, an industrial facility for ship construction. The city had economic life and cultural life existing side by side, and the game placed all of it within walking distance of each other, because in Hoenn the things that mattered to people were not sorted into separate spaces. Mauville's Game Corner carried the familiar structure of previous game corners in the franchise, the slots and the prizes and the exchange of tokens for items or Pokémon. In the remakes, the enclosed mall that replaced the original city made the game corner into something embedded in a larger commercial space, which changed its character without eliminating what it offered. The specific Pokémon available through it varied by game, and the exchange rate between performance and reward was always slightly unfavorable in ways that rewarded patience over urgency. The relationship between Watson and his gym was one of the more visually interesting in Hoenn. The gym's interior was a series of transparent floors above electrical machinery, with trainers positioned across the layout, and Watson himself waiting at the end with his team and his enormous laugh. He found everything funny. The battle was serious to the player and sources of joy to him, and his design communicated someone who had made peace with what he was and what he asked of challengers. An old man who loved electricity and found the idea of battle delightful. The gym leaders of Hoenn were each built around a specific relationship to their type, not just as a team composition, but as a personality. Roxanne treated rock types with the seriousness of a student who had studied them. Brawley brought the meditative calm of someone who had learned to be still inside physical effort. Watson celebrated. Flannery fought with urgency. Norman held back, measured, waiting for the player to make a mistake. Winona soared. Tate and Liza shared a psychic connection that extended to their battle style. Juan was theatrical. Norman's gym was the only one in the franchise where the gym leader was the player's father. The mechanics of that were simple. He was a gym leader. The player needed his badge. The fight had to happen. But the emotional weight of it was not simple. A player who had been told by their mother not to use the bike in the house and had been warned by everyone they met to be careful of Norman, who was eventually placed in a battle against their own parent and asked to win. The game offered no dialogue that made this easy. It just asked for the battle. Winona's gym required ascending to a platform, accessible only by descending from above, the approach to her already requiring a kind of flight, an understanding that she operated in vertical space. Her Altaria and her Swellow and her Pelipper all moved in air, and the battle with her felt like a test not of power, but of whether the player had prepared for creatures that lived where they could not. Beating Winona required having thought about what flew. The Four-Tree City Gym was built into trees, connected by bridges and hidden behind doors that rotated in patterns the player had to learn. The gym design mirrored the city's own architecture. Everything elevated, everything connected by wood and rope, and the decision to live above the ground rather than on it. The gym trainers and the gym leaders shared that elevated perspective, and fighting them felt like fighting in someone else's home, in a space designed for people who had grown comfortable with height. Moss Deep City's gym held 2 leaders rather than 1, which required double battles throughout. Tate and Liza, the psychic twins, fought as a unit that communicated between its 2 members without words. The double battle format was the only format that could express what they were, 2 people thinking as one. A single battle with either of them would have lost the dimension that made them interesting. The game understood this and built their challenge around it. Setopolis City's gym placed Wallace or Hoenn, depending on the version of the game, at the end of a frozen puzzle. The ice floor of the gym required sliding along predetermined paths toward the correct position, the same mechanic that ice floor gyms across the franchise had used. Inside a crater city, accessible only through the water below it, the ice floor added another layer of indirection to reaching the center of the game's most important location. Wallace, when he appeared in Emerald as champion rather than gym leader, had been replaced at the gym by Hoenn, which meant the city still had its water-type identity, even as the most prominent water specialist had moved elsewhere. The Elite Four of Hoenn waited at the end of Victory Road, itself one of the longer and more demanding caves in the franchise. Victory Road was not a formality. It was a final exam, a space populated with strong Pokémon and experienced trainers who would challenge a player whose team was not prepared for the league that waited on the other side. Many players had arrived at Victory Road and found that the gap between where they were and where they needed to be was larger than expected, and had retreated to train in the roots and caves they had already passed through. Sydney opened the Elite Four with dark types and a relaxed posture that suggested he expected the player to fail without being interested in emphasizing it. His Pokémon were fast and hit hard, and the dark type's immunity to psychic meant that strategies which had worked through most of the game were not available here. Phoebe followed with ghost types, and a reverence for the tradition of her family, the island where she had trained, and the connection between the ghost type and the sense that something important waited on the other side of ordinary perception. Glacia brought ice types and an intensity that felt cold, in the way that competence can feel cold, the chill of someone who has prepared thoroughly and does not expect to be surprised. Her Walrein and her Glalie were not flashy. They were durable and methodical. Drake brought dragon types and a sailor's patience, the willingness to wait through difficult conditions for the right moment. His Pokémon were old and heavy with experience, and facing them felt like facing something that had survived many journeys. Stephen Stone's champion team was a statement about what Hoenn valued: steel and rock, the materials of persistence and endurance; Skarmory with its metal feathers; Claydol with its ancient intelligence; Cradily with its fossil origins; Agron with its armored bulk; Armaldo with its prehistoric aggression; and Metagross at the center, the supercomputer made of fused steel organisms, the crown of the team and the most demanding fight the game had offered to that point. Defeating Stephen Stone meant having met a team built on duration and answered it with everything the player had developed over the course of the game. The music that played during the champion battle in the original games carried the weight of everything the game had built toward. It was different in character from the Elite Four themes, which were individual and specific to each trainer. The champion theme in Hoenn was wider, more consequential, a piece of music that communicated the scale of the moment without being dramatic in an empty way. Players who had been through the game remembered the moment the music changed. The Hall of Fame sequence that followed the champion battle placed the player's team into a permanent record, their levels and nicknames, and the date of the battle stored in the game's data. It was a moment of arrival, the game acknowledging what had been accomplished. And then the credits rolled, and Little Root Town appeared again, the beginning of the map visible in a helicopter shot that implied the journey had made something of the traveler. The world was the same. The player had changed. Post-game Hoenn in the original games was primarily the southern islands, accessible through event items, and the continued availability of the Battle Tower. The Battle Tower stood apart from the rest of the game's geography as a space without story, without character interaction in the main narrative sense. It was pure competition, a measurement of how well the player could build and deploy a team within the tower's specific rule set. The currency of the Battle Tower was performance, and the rewards were items that had no other source, exchangeable only for extended success. The Pokémon League building itself was a small place, a cluster of rooms connected by a corridor, its architecture humble in comparison to the journey required to reach it. The final destination of the Hoenn story fit into a space that felt almost understated after Victory Road. That understatement was appropriate. The League was not about the building. It was about the 5 people who waited inside it and what the player could answer to what they offered. Emerald's expansion of the post-game into the Battle Frontier changed what Hoenn meant as a game. The 7 facilities built something that the original games had not. A reason to keep playing after the story was finished that was as demanding and as rewarding as the story itself. Players who had mastered the game found a new kind of mastery waiting for them, and the process of earning frontier symbols from each brain was a project that could occupy months of continued play. The Pokémon themselves changed in their usefulness as the context shifted from the main story to the frontier. Pokémon that had been reliable story companions sometimes struggled in the frontier's specific rule sets. Pokémon that had seemed unremarkable in the story sometimes found that the frontier's conditions suited them precisely. A team built for the main story was not necessarily a team built for the battle arena or the battle palace. The frontier required rethinking what had worked before. The Battle Factory made that rethinking literal and immediate. Players entered it with no Pokémon of their own, selected from a pool of rental creatures, and built a functioning team from unfamiliar options in limited time. The factory was the most demanding test of raw Pokémon knowledge in the frontier because it stripped away the advantages that preparation conferred. A player who knew the game deeply could work with any combination of Pokémon. A player who knew only their own team was left without the tools they had relied on. Factory Head Noland was said to have encountered and befriended a legendary Pokémon through the facility's processes. The specific legendary was Articuno in the anime, which appeared in an episode connected to the facility. The story of a man who befriended a legendary through repeated interaction, through the patient accumulation of mutual understanding, rather than through a climactic encounter, was a different kind of legendary story from the ones the main game told. It was quieter and more earned. The anime's depiction of the battle frontier expanded each facility into a full episode or arc, giving characters and context to places that the games had presented as pure mechanics. Ash's journey through the frontier in the anime was one of the longer sustained arcs in the series, a challenge that took time and produced real setbacks before producing success. He earned each symbol in sequence, and the effort of each was made visible in ways that the game's abbreviated encounter structure could not accommodate. Mei's contest journey in the Hoenn anime paralleled Ash's gym challenge without intersecting it in competition. She was pursuing ribbons, while he was pursuing badges, and the two journeys moved alongside each other through the same geography without one subordinating the other. The Hoenn anime was one of the few periods in the series where a companion's goal was given equal weight to the main characters, where the story genuinely belonged to both travelers. The Pokémon that appeared in the Hoenn anime were given personalities and histories that the games left implied. Ash's Torchic became a character before it became a Combusken and eventually a Blaziken. The arc of that evolution was visible in episode after episode, each stage of development connected to a specific kind of challenge, a specific moment that marked the transition from one form to the next. Though anime treated evolution as an event with emotional weight, rather than a mechanical threshold, a consequence of experience, rather than simply of accumulated experience points. The trading card game concurrent with Generation 3 introduced mechanics that reflected the game's changes. Abilities appeared on cards, and the interplay between card abilities created combinations that rewarded the knowledge of the game's rules in the same way that video game battles rewarded the knowledge of type matchups and stat interactions. Certain Hoenn Pokémon became iconic in the trading card game independent of their status in the video games, their card version more powerful or more interesting mechanically than their video game version, or vice versa. The Hoenn Pokémon that appeared most frequently in the anime tended to be those whose designs communicated most clearly in motion. Pokémon with distinctive silhouettes, with movements that were immediately readable as particular kinds of motion, with battle behaviors that translated well to animation, appeared in more episodes than Pokémon whose designs were more ambiguous or whose battle styles required more explanation. Sharpedo's Torpedo Rush, Flygon's sandstorm-creating wings, Absol's sweeping blade-like horn, all of these were designs built for the kind of visual storytelling that animation excelled at. The Pokémon movies set during the Hoenn era explored the region's mythology in ways the games could not. The film, featuring Latios and Latias, placed the Eon Pokémon in a city built on water, a city with a history of connection between humans and these creatures that extended back generations. The film's tone was warmer than the game's encounter with Latias or Latios, more interested in what it might feel like to be known by a legendary Pokémon than in what it felt like to battle one. The Jirachi film introduced the meteor and the energy associated with Jirachi's awakening as threats as well as gifts. Jirachi's capacity to grant wishes was not benign in all directions. The film explored what happened when that capacity was used by someone who misunderstood what they were asking for, whose wish was shaped by grief rather than by wisdom. The legendary Pokémon was not a simple tool. It was a being with its own relationship to the power it carried, and the film took that seriously. The Deoxys film placed two legendary Pokémon in conflict with each other, and with the city that had grown up in the space one of them considered a territory. The film asked questions about belonging, about what a home was and who had the right to define it, in the language of two psychic Pokémon communicating across a distinction between origin and arrival. It was one of the films most interested in the inner life of the legendary Pokémon themselves, rather than in what those Pokémon could do for human characters. The world of Hoenn contained enough mythology to fill much more than the games provided. The Pokémon they chose to make legendary, and the stories they told about those Pokémon reflected specific decisions about what kind of mythology Hoenn would carry. The weather trio's domain was climatic, elemental, the forces that shaped the physical conditions of the world. The Regitrio's domain was geological and ancient, creatures that had been sealed away from a world that was not ready for them and had waited without impatience through the centuries. The Eon pair's domain was personal, relational, built on the connection between themselves and the human world rather than on dominance over it. Rayquaza held all of this together by being above it, literally above it, living in the ozone layer, existing in a space between the atmosphere and the void, coming down only when called by circumstances that required its intervention. The dragon and flying type combination gave it a home in the sky that was not symbolic but literal. It lived where gravity loosened its grip, where the air thinned into something that sustained nothing ordinary. And it came down from there, when necessary, to end conflicts that had grown too large for the creatures involved to resolve. The mythology of Rayquaza was connected to the ancient people of Hoenn who had built the Sky Pillar and the sealed chamber and the ruins where the Regitrio waited. These unnamed ancient people had understood something about the creatures that shared their world, had built structures that acknowledged the existence of forces they could not control but could perhaps address. The ruins were not monuments to victory. They were monuments to negotiation, to the understanding that some things required accommodation rather than conquest. The Pokédex entries that described these ancient connections were brief and incomplete, as Pokédex entries always were. They offered a sentence or two of lore in a voice that was authoritative but not explanatory, a voice that knew more than it said and chose to offer only the part that fit within the format. The player who read every entry in the region assembled a fragmentary picture of a deeper history, one that the game did not need to tell in full because the fragments were enough to suggest its dimensions. Hoenn's human history was embedded in its geography in ways that required attention to notice. The ruins of what had been built by those ancient people appeared in specific locations. The desert in the north, the seafloor where the sealed chamber sat, the mountain roots where the Regitombs waited. The geography of the ruins was a map of what the ancient people had valued and feared, of where they had chosen to place things they wanted to preserve or contain. The roots of Hoenn were named numerically, but experienced atmospherically. Route 101 was a beginning, a short path between home and the city where the first Pokémon Center waited. Route 102 introduced longer grass and the possibility of encounter with more variety. Each route outward from Little Route increased in density and complexity, offering more and more of what the game contained until the player reached the last routes before the League, which were the most demanding and most varied of all. The numbering imposed order on an experience that felt like discovery. The detail that each route had specific Pokémon available in specific patches of grass, specific tiles of water, specific times of day or weather conditions, created a geography of encounter that rewarded knowledge. A player who knew that Zangoose appeared on this route and not that one, that fishing here produced different catches than fishing there, that the time of day changed which Pokémon were available in the tall grass, moved through Hoenn with a map of what the world contained, overlaid on the map of its physical layout. The two maps together produced something richer than either alone. The HM system of Generation 3 required that the player teach certain Pokémon-specific moves in order to navigate the world. Surf to cross water, strength to move boulders, rock smash to break obstacles, dive to descend into underwater areas, flash to illuminate dark caves, cut to clear certain obstacles. The moves were permanent once learned and could not be unlearned without a specific NPC's help, which meant that teaching an HM to a Pokémon was a commitment, and the commitment had consequences for the Pokémon's move pool. The HM Pokémon, The creature designated to carry the navigational moves that the game required became a feature of how players talked about the game. Which Pokemon would carry Cut and Surf and Strength without those moves interfering too much with its ability to fight. Gyarados could learn Surf, but was a better battler with different moves. Tentacruel could carry multiple Water HMs, but occupied a slot that might be better used for a specific attacker. The logistics of HM distribution were a quiet secondary game played alongside the primary one. In the remakes, the HM system was replaced by a mechanic that allowed Pokemon outside the party to use navigational moves, which removed the constraint without removing the geography it had created. Players could still cross water and move boulders and descend into the seafloor, but no Pokemon in their party had to carry those capabilities, which freed every slot in the team for combat roles. The change was practically convenient and philosophically different from the original system, which had made navigation and combat share the same resource. The hidden machines of Generation 3 were not the only items that shaped movement through Hoenn. The ability to fly to previously visited towns was available from mid-game onward, and it changed the experience of moving through the region dramatically. A player who had Fly could return instantly to any city they had visited, making backtracking a question of willingness rather than time. The physical distances of Hoenn became irrelevant when a Pokemon could carry the player from Moss Deep to Littleroot in moments. The bicycle in Hoenn came in two forms: the Mach Bike, which moved fast enough to traverse certain bridges and pass through certain surfaces, and the Acro Bike, which allowed tricks and could hop to reach specific areas. Neither bike could be used everywhere the other could, and the game's geography contained areas that were accessible only with the correct bike. A player who had chosen one could not access certain optional areas without trading for the other, which made the choice of bike a decision with geographic consequences. The bicycle mechanics reflected the game's broader interest in creating layers of accessibility within its world. Many areas required specific items or move capabilities to enter, and the accumulation of those access points over the course of the game opened the world progressively. A player returning to an early route with later capabilities would find things they could not have reached on their first visit: hidden items, optional encounters, areas sealed behind HM requirements that had not been available yet. Hoenn rewarded revisiting. The diving spots in Hoenn were marked by patches of darker water, a visual indicator that the ocean in that location was deep enough to descend into. Below the surface, the underwater areas were lit differently from the overworld. The color palette shifted toward green and blue, and the Pokemon encountered there were specific to the underwater environment. Relicanth and Chinchou and Horsea and Clamperl waited beneath the surface, accessible only to players who had obtained the Dive HM and were willing to press into a space that the game made feel genuinely different from everything above it. The sealed chamber waited at the bottom of one of those diving spots, the entrance visible only when the player surfaced inside the underwater space. The chamber contained the Braille inscription that led to the Reggie trio, and finding the chamber required not just having the HM, but knowing where to look for the darker water that indicated its location. Some players found it by accident, others found it through guidance, and some spent considerable time surfing over every patch of dark water in the region before locating the correct one. The patience required to find the sealed chamber, to decode the Braille, to perform the correct actions in the correct order across 3 separate ruins was part of what made the Reggie trio feel significant. The game had asked for sustained engagement before it offered the encounter. A legendary Pokemon unlocked through frustration and triumph felt different from one encountered through the game's natural forward momentum. The Reggie trio required earning in a way that Groudon and Kyogre did not. The relationship between version exclusives in Ruby and Sapphire extended beyond just which legendary Pokémon was the primary antagonist's goal. Certain Pokémon appeared in one version and not the other, creating the trade dependency that had structured the franchise since the beginning. Zangoose appeared in Ruby, while Seviper appeared in Sapphire, Seedot's line in Ruby, Lotad's line in Sapphire, Mawile in Ruby, Sableye in Sapphire. The exclusives were sometimes chosen to reinforce the thematic distinction between versions, and sometimes seem to have been distributed more arbitrarily. Either way, completing the Pokédex without trading was impossible by design. The Pokédex completion goal in Generation 3 was made more complex by the existence of the National Pokédex alongside the Hoenn Pokédex. The Hoenn Pokédex contained 135 entries, completable within the games themselves through the story and available wild Pokémon. The National Pokédex required Pokémon from other generations, obtainable only through trading with Fire Red and Leaf Green events in the specific connection games that allowed earlier Pokémon to migrate forward. The goal of completing the National Pokédex was a long-term project measured in games rather than hours. The Professor Birch, who offered the player their starter Pokémon, was characterologically specific in a way that the game used to establish Hoenn's identity early. He was a field researcher who worked outside, who encountered dangerous situations and needed help, who presented the player's beginning not as a laboratory gift, but as a practical intervention. The context of receiving a starter Pokémon to help a professor in trouble made the beginning feel active rather than ceremonial, which was appropriate for a game that was about to send the player into a world that started with ocean and ended with the sky. The rival in Hoenn, who in Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald was named May or Brendan depending on the player's choice, appeared throughout the game at specific moments and grew in power across each encounter. But the rival structure in Hoenn was gentler than in some other regions. The rival here was not antagonistic. They were simply another trainer pursuing the same goals, and their encounters were friendly competitions rather than reminders of superiority. The emotional texture of each rival encounter was warm, curious, occasionally impressed. May's appearance as a recurring character in the anime, pursuing contests while Ash pursued the gym challenge, gave the concept of the rival a different shape than the games provided. She was not competing with Ash, but alongside him, and her own journey had a direction and a goal that the viewer followed independently. The Hoenn anime's decision to give its female companion a separate narrative instead of a supporting one was significant in retrospect, a structural choice that expanded what the game's companion character represented. The games of Generation 3 introduced 2 different save files as a combined consequence of the fact that Fire Red and Leaf Green existed alongside Ruby and Sapphire. A player could have multiple games running simultaneously, which multiplied the number of Pokémon they could accumulate, breed, and trade. The Pokémon box software for the GameCube extended the available storage further, allowing players to hold far more Pokémon than any single game's box system could accommodate. The infrastructure of Pokémon keeping grew more elaborate as the number of Pokémon available grew larger. The Savii Islands, accessible in Fire Red and Leaf Green, were not part of Hoenn, but were connected to it through trading. They offered encounters with Pokémon from the Johto region and expanded the lore of the Fire Red and Leaf Green games beyond what the original Red and Blue had contained. The islands themselves were part of Kanto's geography, but their connection to the trading system that linked Generation 3 games together made them part of Hoenn's ecosystem in the practical sense. Obtaining certain Pokémon for the National Pokédex required visiting the islands, which required Fire Red or Leaf Green, which required trading with those games. The connection between games in Generation 3 was the most elaborate trading and migration infrastructure that the franchise had built to that point. The Union Room allowed wireless trading and battling between players with Game Boy Advance systems and link cables or the wireless adapter. The Pokemon Center's Cable Club offered a connection point within the game's world. The GTS would not arrive until the next generation, but the infrastructure of connection was already being treated as essential rather than optional. The in-game trades offered by NPCs throughout Hoenn had their own quirks. A Pokemon obtained through trade gained an experience bonus, growing faster than a Pokemon caught by the same player. But it also had a different happiness baseline, starting from a particular value associated with traded Pokemon rather than from the value associated with caught Pokemon. The traded Pokemon was in a new relationship, and the game tracked that as a condition. The happiness evolutions available in Hoenn required building that relationship over time through battles won and steps taken, and berries given and massages received and haircuts visited. The invisible counter that measured friendship rose through sustained positive engagement and fell through neglect or injury. A player who wanted a Pokemon to evolve through happiness had to make choices across many interactions, each small contribution accumulating toward a threshold they could not directly observe. Chimecho was one of the harder Pokemon to find in the region, despite being a full evolutionary Pokemon rather than a version exclusive or a legendary. It appeared only in specific grass patches on Mount Pyre at a low encounter rate, in a location that players sometimes bypassed entirely if they did not know to linger there. Its ringing cry and its wind chime appearance made it visually distinctive, and the difficulty of finding it gave it a scarcity that felt appropriate for something so delicate. The fire, water, and grass types formed a triangle that organized the game's ecology at the level of the starter, but they also organized the ecology of the wild Pokemon, the gym leaders, the Elite Four, and the champion. The triangle ensured that at any given point in the game, a player who had built a varied team could find something effective against whatever they were facing. The triangle was the game's structural guarantee that no single approach would dominate from beginning to end. The late-game areas of Hoenn introduced Pokemon that had not been available earlier, creatures that appeared only in the final routes or in specific post-story locations: the Chimecho on Mount Pyre, the Absol on Route 120, the Kecleon hidden on routes where they were invisible against the background until walked into. These late discoveries extended the feeling of a world still being found, even as the story reached its conclusion. The region had not exhausted itself by the time the credits rolled. The wild encounter rate in tall grass was a constant background condition of moving through Hoenn's routes. Every few steps, an encounter became possible, and the game's random number generator determined whether one occurred and what appeared. Players who wanted to move quickly learned to use repels, which suppressed encounters temporarily. Players who wanted to train learned to walk without repels and accept whatever appeared. The encounter rate was a rhythm that the game imposed and the player negotiated. The held items that wild Pokemon occasionally carried were another layer of the world's generosity. A Pokemon found in the wild might be holding a berry or a stone or a functional item that the player could then use. Some held items were common and easy to obtain. Others appeared on Pokemon with low encounter rates and required either persistence or a specific move that could take items without triggering a full battle. The world rewarded those who looked closely at what the creatures they encountered were carrying. The effort value mechanics of Generation 3 interacted with the wild encounter system in ways that rewarded strategic thinking about which Pokemon to defeat. A player building a team for competitive use would choose specific wild Pokemon to battle based on which EVs they yielded, which meant that the tall grass of Hoenn became not just an obstacle or a training ground, but a resource to be managed. The route that gave speed EVOs was different from the route that gave special attack EVOs, and knowing the difference mattered if the goal was a specific stat distribution. The Pokerus condition was most valuable during this EV training process, doubling the yield from every battle. A player who discovered Pokerus and preserved it in their box had a multiplicative advantage in all future training. The condition spread through the party during battles, infecting Pokémon that were in contact with an infected member, and the spread could be managed by boxing the infected Pokémon before the infection passed, preserving it indefinitely in the dormant form. The entire system of hidden values, natures, effort values, and Pokerus existed beneath the surface of a game that never mentioned most of it directly. Players who engaged with only the visible layer of Hoenn played a different game from those who had learned the hidden one. Both versions of the game were Hoenn. Both were complete in their own terms. The hidden layer did not diminish the visible one. It extended it for those who wanted to go further. The Pokémon contests existed as a complete alternative to the hidden layer's complexity. They had their own depth, their own preparation requirements, their own community of players who found them more engaging than the battle system. A player who spent their time in Hoenn raising Pokémon specifically for contests, blending Pokéblocks, seeking specific combinations of contest moves, was participating in a version of the game that the battle-focused player might never touch. The game contained both versions and treated neither as less than the other. The Pokéblock colors corresponded to different contest stats, and the berries used in blending determined which colors the resulting Pokéblocks would be. Learning the system required understanding which berries produced which results and in what combination, and then finding those berries, and then growing them in sufficient quantity to support the blending necessary to raise a Pokémon's contest stats to the highest levels. The agricultural, the culinary, and the competitive were all aspects of a single connected system. The ribbons earned through the contest hall came in levels corresponding to the contest difficulty: normal rank, super rank, hyper rank, and master rank, across all 5 contest categories. A Pokémon that had earned ribbons in all 5 categories at the highest rank would have 20 ribbons from contests alone, plus any additional ribbons from other sources. The total accumulation of ribbons was visible on the Pokémon's summary screen as a record of what had been accomplished. The ribbons did not improve the Pokémon's performance. They were purely commemorative, which made them more meaningful rather than less. The question of what a Pokémon game was, fundamentally, was one that Hoenn answered differently from the generations before it. It was a collection game, yes, and a battle game, and a puzzle game when the gym designs were taken seriously. But it was also a farming game, and a fashion game, and a navigation game, and a competitive optimization game, and a social game that required interacting with other players to complete. Hoenn did not introduce most of these dimensions, but it expanded and deepened each of them in ways that made the game's total scope larger than any single player could fully experience in a single playthrough. The experience of beginning Hoenn again, whether in the original Ruby and Sapphire or in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, was the experience of entering a world that already contained everything. The player would not find all of it. They would find as much as they looked for, which was different for every player and different again on every playthrough. The 135 Pokémon waited in their roots, in their caves, and their patches of dark water, unchanged from the last time they were found, ready to be found again. That readiness is part of what the games preserved across generations of hardware and software updates and remakes and spin-offs. The Pokémon of Hoenn remained available, remained specific, remained layered in the same ways they had always been layered. The facts about them accumulated in the community over years of play and research and comparison, and the accumulation grew larger than any single source could contain. New things were discovered long after the games had been played by millions of players. Old things were understood differently as more context arrived. The Hoenn games were made by people who cared about the details they were placing in the world, and the details they placed there were worth caring about. Every Pokemon in the region held something worth knowing, and the knowing of it connected the player to the intention behind the design, to the people who had spent time thinking about what a small black marking on a Torchic could reference, what a polar bear with an aurora stripe could have been, what the difference between 6 water tiles and 430 was worth in terms of the significance of finding what lived in those 6 tiles. The significance was real. It was created deliberately, and it persisted in the experience of playing the game, in the memory of finding something rare, in the satisfaction of understanding why a design made the choices it made. The facts about Hoenn's Pokémon were not trivial. They were the material of which the experience was made, the stuff that gave the world its texture and its depth. And they remained there, in the tall grass and the water and the sealed chambers, in the moves that Pokémon could not learn despite what their Pokédex entries said, in the catch rates that placed ordinary Pokémon next to legendary ones, in the beta designs that almost arrived, and the final designs that carried their echoes forward. They waited, as they always had, for someone willing to look closely enough to find them. That is where all of it begins again, in the space before knowing, which is also the space most like sleep. The region waits there, specific and layered and patient, as it has always waited, full of small details that reward the attention of anyone willing to give them time. The facts that have traveled through this evening are only some of them. There are always more. Hoenn is deep enough that there are always more. The Pokémon of Hoenn sleep in their roots, and their caves, waiting for someone to step into the tall grass. The water types wait just below the surface of the ocean. The legendary Pokémon wait in sealed chambers, and at the top of stone towers, and in the sky. They have been waiting there since the game was made, which is a different kind of waiting from the waiting of living things, but not entirely different. They wait to be found by someone paying attention. And paying attention is its own kind of rest. The slow accumulation of small things, fact by fact, detail by detail, one Pokemon at a time, until the mind grows quieter and the facts themselves become less important than the feeling of receiving them gently. That is what this has been, a slow walk through something loved at a pace that sleep could join without disrupting. The 135 Pokemon of Hoenn carry their meanings quietly forward through every generation of players who find them. They remain specific, they remain patient, and on the right kind of night, they are exactly the right kind of company. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.